Nothing but thick trees surrounded him. Only then the boy realized he had crossed into another world. He noticed a huge white wolf lying calmly nearby. Despite how strange the situation was, he felt no fear. The dark-haired young man smiled and eased down beside the wolf, placing his hands on its warm body. His joy was genuine because the wolf's fur was surprisingly soft and pleasant. People say the unexpected leaves the mind in a fog, and the boy found himself in that tangled, unclear state where nothing could lift the strange haze. Hovering in the air, he looked around with curiosity. His eyes scanned everything, taking in every detail as he tried to figure out where he had landed. Tenno Akiro was 35. He couldn't understand why he had ended up here and frowned as he tried to remember the last moments of his life and what he'd been doing before. A haze seemed to cloud his mind that morning, so he overslept. Still, he left for work as usual and, after his shift, walked home slowly holding his phone. Crossing the crosswalk, Tenno read a message from his sister asking him to buy a yogurt on the way, and having already bought it, he hurried home as fast as he could. His plans were cut short. A huge truck was racing toward him before he even noticed. There was no time to dodge and the collision was inevitable. The last thing he remembered was the strike of the metal monster. Snapping out of his memories, Tenno finally looked around and saw 4 more people who had been hit by the car, all lying unconscious. Suddenly the 4 began to glow with a bright light that surrounded their bodies, and the boy watched in surprise, thinking they had come to their senses. But he was wrong. Tenno noted with interest that the light had not touched him. Then a desperate voice pierced the space, full of panic and helplessness, and someone asked aloud what to do now. The young man turned his head looking for the voice's owner, but no one was nearby. The stranger kept shouting, and the other 4 suddenly vanished as if they had dissolved into the air. The voice continued to fill the space, insisting they had already been discovered, while the other speaker replied quietly, admitting their powerlessness and inability to change anything. Suddenly, one of them noticed another person still in the room. Tenno listened awkwardly to the conversation, feeling he did not belong there. The voices sounded surprised when they noticed the dark-haired boy standing nearby, since they hadn't realized he was there and were taken aback. As he listened to them, Tenno realized he should not be part of this, and although he had only recently joined the others, he felt like an outsider in the whole affair. A commanding voice filled the space again, angrily scolding his interlocutor for warning about the danger of summoning and how it breaks the world's laws, and the interlocutor stayed silent with no excuse before offering a timid explanation as Tenno listened in surprise. Suddenly his body began to dissolve into the void. He felt himself fading and, terrified, realized he was falling downward into the unknown. A few moments later he was in a forest. Looking up in surprise, he saw a thick green canopy of leaves above him that blocked the light from the sky. The boy still could not tell where he was. With great effort he pushed himself up from the ground. His body felt heavy and sluggish. Finally, after fighting through exhaustion, Tenno managed to get to his feet. Standing up, the boy looked around and bitterly realized he was in a gloomy forest. Taking a step forward, he tried to leave as quickly as he could, but the darkness and threatening silence filled him with fear. Tenno wondered where he was, and remembering snatches of strangers' talk, he guessed he had accidentally stumbled into a ritual to summon a hero. A smile crossed his face at the thought, and he remembered his sister's love of comics that took the hero to another world. She had often told him stories like that, but he never thought it could happen to him. Now he found himself in another world, like a scene from those tales. Tenno finally understood that the place he had been taken to did not belong to his reality. He wondered whether any way back existed. Then he stopped, anger rising as the thought of his situation burned even hotter. He could not hold back and, with all his fury, shouted everything he believed had happened to him, his cry echoing among the dark trees like a challenge to the forest. After releasing some emotions, the young man felt relief in his chest, and knew the most important thing now was to calm down and assess the situation clearly. His sister's words made Tenno pause, because her favorite stories always filled other worlds with magic and demons, and that thought put him on guard. Startled by his own scream, he realized he had given himself away by being too loud. His heart pounded as he looked around, but fortunately no one appeared. Tenno exhaled and realized his situation was dire. His body still felt a strange, heavy weight, as if something cold and sticky had been clinging to him since he woke. Looking at his palm, he felt a strange tingling, like an invisible force slowly entering his body and squeezing him from the inside. Looking around, he heard only leaves rustling in the wind. Realizing he should find someone to ask for help, he found only gloomy trees everywhere. His condition kept getting worse. Such exhaustion was something he had never felt before, not even in the toughest moments of his life. The boy felt uneasy as the forest itself looked menacing. A thought crossed his mind that this place might be cursed and was draining his strength. Maybe an evil spirit lived here, clinging unseen to travelers, and Tenno forced the thought away, trying not to give in to fear. Suddenly the wind picked up, the trees groaned, and the leaves spun around with a fierce crackle. At that moment, the boy felt a touch on his hand and his body shuddered with fear. Trembling, he whispered cleansing words under his breath, hoping they would drive the evil away. Then the wind, as if obeying, stopped as suddenly as it had started. A heavy silence settled over the forest. Realizing how foolish he had been, he felt awkward. Fear of the unknown gripped him, though he did not even know if magic or spirits existed in this world. Sighing, he still noticed something strange. He looked at his palm and froze in surprise. His body suddenly felt lighter and the exhaustion vanished. Strength returned, and Tenno felt his life force fill every cell. Facing the forest, he saw thick, dark smoke rising through the trees. Resolutely, he thrust his hand forward and spoke a cleansing spell, aiming his palm straight into the heart of the darkness. The next moment, as soon as the boy spoke the cleansing spell, the thick black smoke began to slowly clear, as if pushed away by an invisible force. Tenno, a little stunned, stared at the palm he had held out toward the black mist and could hardly believe his action had made the dark smoke disappear. A moment later, terror hit him. The boy realized a sinister spirit had settled inside him, and there was no longer any doubt that this world obeyed the laws of magic. Realizing that sometimes escaping reality can be helpful, he now believed something amazing. Magic existed here. The forest's silence was suddenly broken by an alarming sound. Massive footsteps sounded behind him, and Tenno froze in fear, slowly turning as he heard the beast's menacing growl. Turning completely, he saw a wolf of incredible size before him, and his heart shook with terror because the beast was so huge it seemed like a real monster. At first, the young man thought it was a dog. The predator's stare left no doubt. It was a wolf with a dangerous, predatory gleam in its eyes. The boy didn't know what to do. Fighting such an opponent would be pointless. He rose carefully and began to back away, but the wolf suddenly stepped forward. The movement made his blood freeze. Tenno was sure that if he ran, the beast would immediately chase him. Deep down, he begged the wolf to just leave him alone. On closer inspection, the young man saw the beast's paws trembling as if an unseen pain were tearing it apart. He quickly shook off the thought because he still felt like prey and could think of only one thing: escaping this dangerous place. No sooner had he moved than the wolf snarled and lunged at him, and Tenno screamed in terror, feeling his heart leap out of his chest. Instead of attacking, the beast collapsed to the ground as if it had lost all its strength in an instant. The boy stared in shock at the wolf lying on the ground. The wolf bared its teeth and kept its eyes on him, trying even with its stare to keep any possible attacker at a distance. Tenno realized the wolf was also being consumed by the same black smoke that had recently crept over the forest. It was suffering, even as it tried to look threatening. Despite his fear, the boy felt the need to help. Realizing he had to save the animal, he pushed past his fear because his childhood love of playing with animals never left him. Having just undergone the cleansing, he knew the black mist no longer had power over him. Fear of the wolf still tightened his chest, but he felt he had to try. Summoning his courage, the young man reached out his hand toward the massive beast, preparing to speak the spell. In that instant, he spoke the words of cleansing, and the black smoke around the wolf began to fade quickly, pulling back from the bright light. A smile spread across Tenno's face when the spell worked. The poisonous mist's hold faded, and the beast was free. The wolf stared at him, stunned and unsure of what had just happened. The huge beast could not understand what had happened, or where the black smoke that had wrapped its body had gone. The wolf looked at itself in surprise as the crippling fatigue began to fade. Moved by the giant wolf's behavior, Tenno even wanted to pet it, since now, despite its size, the animal seemed majestic and noble rather than threatening. The beast's thick fur stayed dirty, and Tenno, a true Japanese who valued cleanliness, could not help feeling uncomfortable as a white wolf slowly moved toward him. Only when the predator drew near did the boy come to. His heart filled with fear, and he braced himself, sure the beast would attack at any moment. Instead of attacking, the wolf lay on its back and offered its belly to show trust in the boy, and Tenno watched with delight at the animal's fluffy belly that looked very soft. The wolf stood up, wagging its tail happily from side to side. The young man wondered how to clean the dirt from its fur and quietly hoped that magic could help. The boy cast a cleansing spell. In an instant, the dirty fur turned gleaming white, and the wolf looked even more noble than before. Tenno couldn't take his eyes off the transformed beast. Its beauty stunned him, and he only came to himself when the wolf walked into the forest without looking back. Stunned, he asked whether the animal really intended to leave him. The wolf turned and fixed the boy with a piercing stare, trying to say something without words. Soon they were racing forward together. Tenno ran ahead of the wolf, trying not to fall behind, and the wolf watched him in surprise, sensing he was not an ordinary man. 200 years ago, a darkness fell over this forest. People caused the catastrophe, and since then the darkness has swallowed even the animals. Only the strongest managed to survive in those conditions. The weak monsters were destroyed, and among those left stood King Fenrir. For long centuries, Fenrir guarded the forest, witnessing the deaths and suffering of countless inhabitants. With his immense magical power, he held the darkness back for a time, but the cleansing spells he used only stopped the gloom temporarily, and each one drained a huge amount of his strength. Repeating spells drained him faster than he could recover. Now exhausted, Fenrir realized he could not hold out against the darkness for long. The wolf refused to think about defeat, his heart filled with hatred for the people he blamed for the coming darkness. And as he neared death, he was determined to destroy them all. A human scent hit him nearby. Furious, Fenrir lunged forward, intent on mercilessly destroying whoever he saw. Only one thought consumed him, the desire to wipe another human being off the face of the earth. He surged forward, filled with fierce hatred. Soon his eyes caught the dark-haired boy, Tenno, but Fenrir felt neither pity nor hesitation. When it came closer, strength suddenly left its body, and the beast could no longer stand on its paws and stopped, exhausted. King Fenrir bared his teeth at the man, his eyes blazing with fury even as his body refused to obey, and he could not believe he was so weak in that moment. Tenno advanced slowly toward him. The wolf resisted, but the darkness drained his life force and his vision began to blur. Fenrir fought to stay conscious. Deep disappointment filled him. For the first time in hundreds of years, he lay helpless before a human, unable even to get up. A strange feeling swept through him as the power of the darkness suddenly faded, and his body grew light, and he looked with surprise at the boy who had cast the cleansing spell on him. Initially, he expected the effect to be brief, as always. Minute after minute passed, and the darkness did not return. It felt impossible. He was struck by how much radiant power came from this person. Tenno watched him closely, as if waiting for an answer. Cleansing magic flowed through the wolf's body, healing him and driving out the darkness, and the sensation was so strong he froze in amazement. He had never seen such pure, endless magic before. He looked at the youth again, but this time his predatory snarl did not scare Tenno. For the first time in his life, King Fenrir recognized someone worth accepting and, without hesitation, showed his submission to the boy. After a while, Tenno climbed to the top of a hill with a flat area covered in grass and flowers. The boy climbed the slope with surprising ease, as if his body felt no fatigue. A white wolf climbed beside him, and he enjoyed feeling every muscle working. The dark-haired youth saw King Fenrir climb the slope and move forward. The beast's actions intrigued him, and Tenno found himself following. A cave lay ahead, completely shrouded in dangerous darkness. Sensing its power, Fenrir bared his teeth and let out a menacing snarl, ready to challenge the gloom. The boy could tell from the wolf's behavior that it wanted to come inside, but he still asked if this was really their path, and Fenrir nodded while Tenno smiled, touched by the sweet reaction. An endless cave opened before them, completely swallowed by darkness. Visibility vanished after a few steps, and the only clear thing was that the darkness ruled here without relief. At last the young man stepped inside, anxiety tightening his chest, but he could no longer avoid the path. An irritated wolf nudged his side, so the boy awkwardly said it was just a joke, and then used cleansing magic at the entrance. When the spell took hold, the gloom began to lift, and the cave soon grew brighter. The darkness receded, but did not disappear, leaving uneasy shadows inside. When he entered, he was surprised to see the curse still clinging to this place, and Tenno wondered how deep the cave was and why the darkness remained so stubborn. Suddenly eyes shone in the darkness before him. They belonged to creatures crouched there. The boy realized they were wolves and the cave was their den. A whole pack bared its teeth, preparing to attack, but Fenrir stopped them in time with a single growl, and the pack immediately fell back. At his voice, the wolves eased a little but still watched Tenno with suspicion. Darkness still clung to their bodies. Seeing this, the boy used the cleansing spell again, and the wolves shuddered at the light magic as the curse slowly left them. A horrible scene unfolded before him. Figures of wolves rose from the pack, mangled and broken by the darkness. Their bodies were falling apart before him. Fenrir stared in bitter despair at the 6 followers swallowed by the darkness. The other wolves lowered their heads, mourning their lost kin. It struck Tenno's heart. He was pained by their grief and vowed to help the pack and lift the curse at any cost. Imagining the darkness drawing back further, he focused and began a new cleansing spell, pouring all his strength into it. White light filled the cave and flowed toward the cursed wolves. Rivers of magic wrapped their weary bodies, trying to pull the darkness from their claws. In an instant, the darkness, along with the dead bodies, began to dissolve, and the boy and the wolves watched sadly, aware the losses were irreversible. Tenno felt a fresh surprise when he noticed that among the creatures were not only wolves but dogs, and that they survived together in the darkness. On closer inspection, he noticed with disgust how dirty the animals were. His words made them hang their heads even lower. The youth was surprised they understood his words. He then cast the cleansing spell again, and the wolves' and dogs' fur shone, becoming silky and clean. They looked completely different, friendly and cheerful now. Smiling, Tenno watched the group and then considered his next move. 2 extra passages in the cave led deeper. Curiosity took hold, and he asked Fenrir what might be there, but even the king did not know the answer. Tenno realized the animals understood him, so he decided to trust them and keep going. As he moved deeper, the darkness grew thicker. The boy tensed and repeated the cleansing spell to disperse the gloom. He moved on, now and then using cleansing magic around him to keep the threat in check. After a while, Tenno grew anxious because the darkness still had not lifted, even after countless spells, and it worried him more and more. Later he realized the curse had begun affecting Fenrir again, which was dangerous, so the boy urgently needed a way to save the pack and decided to create a barrier. It was hard to imagine, but he understood that it was better to build one shared defense than to waste effort on separate barriers for each. Tenno immediately cast a barrier over the whole pack, and a warm light wrapped their bodies. The animals felt instant relief as the weight of the darkness lifted. Seeing the barrier surround them in a warm glow, Tenno realized the spell had worked, but he worried it might not hold against physical attacks, since they did not know what awaited deeper in the dungeon. Deciding to strengthen the defense, the young man wanted the barrier to repel not only magical strikes but also real physical attacks that could harm the pack. The next moment, he tried to add a new defensive ability to the barrier. Concentrating, Tenno cast an enhancement spell, pouring extra energy into it. The barrier immediately became denser, its structure seeming to harden. Fenrir looked at the youth in surprise, who explained he had reinforced the protection around everyone. They were safe from now on. After that, the boy and the wolf pack moved on down the dark passage, and Tenno kept clearing the area, pushing back the darkness with every step. Before long, he was surprised to find the cave much larger than he'd imagined. They didn't stop, since only thick darkness lay ahead. The young man began thinking how to use magic to get a better look at the cave's shape. Only night vision or clairvoyance spells came to mind. He had no clear idea of what to imagine for this, and the challenge was learning to perceive space without relying only on his eyes. Finally, Tenno tried 2 spells at once, night vision and spatial sense, closing his eyes and immediately feeling the space around him in his head. Though only a projection in his mind, the sensation felt remarkably real. The young man decided to cleanse every inch of the cave and immediately released a wave of purifying magic. Darkness began to recede. To keep it from returning, Tenno secured a barrier in the cave walls. Smiling, he finally saw the space clearly. Suddenly, the whole pack snarled and bared its teeth, all looking in the same direction. The young man grew alert and turned to look that way. A giant black boulder rose up in front of him. The boy was surprised, and a moment later, a flash of light burst from inside, lighting up the whole cave. He barely had time to shield his eyes from the bright glare. When he looked again, the boulder was lodged in the wall, and cold sweat ran down his skin. Confused, he realized something had hit the barrier. Frightened, Tenno asked Fenrir if the stone could be cursed. The wolf did not respond. It only stared at him with a sharp, piercing gaze. The young man was captivated by the creature's majesty despite the danger. His moment of tenderness vanished at once when the black boulder attacked again. The barrier kept them from harm, while the rock relentlessly tried to force its way through. Tenno began to suspect the boulder was alive. Fenrir's behavior reminded him of their first meeting. That prompted him to try a cleansing spell on the boulder. The cleansing magic failed. The young man realized his power was too weak, or the curse on the stone was too strong and stubborn. To make it irreversible, he strengthened his spell and pictured the cleansing process more deeply. Until then, he pictured cleansing as in the movies, but he realized it wouldn't work on solid matter, and that a different, much more resilient approach was needed. He pictured the darkness as a tough film to be peeled away layer by layer until it was gone for good. He focused and cast the cleansing spell again. This time the darkness began to peel away from the boulder like a thin shell. After a long struggle, the black film peeled away and dissolved. From beneath the stone, a bird that had long been bound by darkness emerged, and Tenno stood frozen with shock. Soon the little bird came to, the darkness lifting from its body, and it trembled, stood on its feet, and flapped its wings. After taking off, it flew to the boy who had reached out his hand. The bird landed on his palm, and the young man saw the wounds on its body with horror. Although the treatment was difficult, Tenno was determined to heal her. He first set out to cleanse the damaged cells, then to treat the wounds with healing and purification spells. In that instant, all the dirt and injuries vanished from the bird. It looked remarkably beautiful, and the boy admired it, though he thought it was too small. The bird was offended by his careless comment. It started pecking his palm to show its annoyance. Tenno apologized, looking guilty. As an apology, he gently stroked her little head. The bird nestled contentedly and closed its eyes in pleasure, and the young man was moved and immediately forgot the pain. Having finished clearing the boulder made by darkness, the boy decided to rest a little to regain his strength and for a moment gather his thoughts. Resting, Tenno saw the cave walls glowing thanks to the barrier he had created, protecting him and his companions from the sinister influence of the darkness. Too much had hit him in a short time. The dark-haired young man felt muddled and could barely make sense of what was happening. Loud strikes suddenly echoed through the cave. The wolves tensed at the barrier, and Tenno realized that the darkness itself was trying to force its way through his defense. More and more darkness beat against the barrier, trying to break in and maim every living thing. The boy feared his protection might not withstand the assault. He watched in silence as the darkness attacked, but the barrier proved strong and unyielding and would not let the curse break through. Seeing that, Tenno exhaled in relief, turned away, and decided to set aside thoughts about the nature of the new magical power for later. Everything looked reasonably safe for now. The barrier kept them secure, but the young man noticed a strange change in the wolf pack's behavior. To his surprise, he noticed the animals looked much livelier and more cheerful. The wolves relaxed and even seemed happy. He was worried because he had not seen them eat anything. Earlier they had looked worn out and weak, but now they seemed revived as if someone had fed them. He didn't waste time thinking about it. Whatever the explanation, finding a safe place, water, and food was more important now. To survive, he had to take care of his basic needs. Though in trouble, Tenno resolved to get out and not let the situation break him. He pointed out that the cave could be a shelter for the night. If they cleared the space, they could spend the night here in relative safety. First, something had to be done about the black shadow. The blows on the barrier kept coming, and the boy knew that the defense's reaction meant the darkness was leaking from inside. A wave of worry gripped him, and he felt he had to do something about it right away before it was too late. Having used magic recently, he realized he could not cleanse the place without knowing exactly where they were. First, he had to explore the cave thoroughly to know what he was up against. He tried to cast a spell to survey the area. A dim view of the forest around them filled his sight, but a thick, dark shadow hid the details, and he realized that looking from a different angle might reveal something. Thick gloom kept him from seeing what was outside, which made him even more uneasy, and he frantically searched for a way to resolve it. He decided to use clairvoyance because he needed a way to see the space from different angles. He wanted to see from above. A simple answer came to him: a drone. If he pictured the spell as a drone, it could survey the area. He remembered once seeing drone footage on TV of a crimson sunset over a majestic canyon, and it left a strong impression. Inspired by this, Tenno imagined a clairvoyance spell as a drone, and suddenly a computer tower appeared before him as if from his imagination. He succeeded. A monitor appeared before him, showing a clear panorama of the forest. The forest was shrouded in thick darkness, and a flat-topped mountain rose on the horizon. Tenno realized they were on a huge mountain, and even spotted the tiny entrance they had come through, which was almost invisible against the mountain's scale. All that remained was to imagine how he would cover this place with a barrier dome and cleanse the mountain of darkness. He recalled the spell to banish curses and thought that by cleansing the shadow, he could finally destroy the curse on this land. The idea pleased him, and he immediately cast the cleansing spell. On the monitor, he saw the darkness lift, leaving the mountain clear. In the next moment, the young man raised a barrier dome over the whole area, so the darkness would never return. For a moment, a bright light blinded everyone. The wolves stared at his actions in shock. A surge of power burst from Tenno's body. Magic filled him. Darkness faded from every corner, and an unyielding barrier glowed over the entire area. The area was completely cleansed of the curse. Dark shadows were gone, and nature shone with light, filled with the fresh scent after the darkness faded. The boy watched it on the monitor with joy, and the wolf pack admired their forest, which for the first time in a long time looked peaceful and clean. And within an hour, Tenno fell quiet, annoyed that the darkness had returned despite the barrier, and he noticed a black shadow seeping from inside. Darkness came not from above, but from beneath the earth, and the boy was stunned because the barrier he had placed was powerless against that source. He quickly pulled himself together. Irritated and angry, Tenno decided to act and use magic again to stop the spreading darkness. The boy widened and deepened the barrier, sinking it into the earth to keep the darkness from getting out forever. Filled with resolve, Tenno vowed to do everything to defend the forest and banish the darkness for good, wielding cleansing magic with renewed strength. He cast another barrier spell. A bright light briefly lit the area, and a protective dome rose over the ground. When the area of forest had been fully cleared and secured, Tenno sank onto the stone floor, exhausted. Physically, he felt resilient, but mentally, he was utterly exhausted. Constant use of magic had drained him. An awkward smile revealed his hands trembling with fatigue. Leaning on them, he felt helpless and bewildered, dreaming only of returning to his world. Fenrir broke his gloomy thoughts by coming over and lying on his lap as a comfort, and Tenno asked with a tired laugh whether he was really a wild beast. Realizing he couldn't change his situation, he saw grieving was pointless. His only hope was that his magic would truly cleanse the mountain, and he noticed how much he had changed after meeting the wolf. Elsewhere, in the dead of night under the glow of 2 moons, the kingdom's people slept peacefully, unaware of the danger. A strange event occurred in the palace. A dark, uncut stone hovered in the hall and gave off light, and suddenly a crack appeared on its surface. The next morning, a servant brought the king strange news about Fenrir, the lord of the forest. Fenrir sat on his throne, smugly waiting for good news. The servant continued. A glow was seen in the center of the forest that spread across most of the land. The king smiled smugly, and thought this was the last flicker of life for the forest king and his entire pack. After that, he ordered his subordinate to bring more victims to the Devil's Stone. The servant obeyed at once. The king took pleasure in the thought of destroying the forest lord. Only a little time remained for him to conquer the world with this forest. Gazing out the window, he thought the monsters still asleep would wake soon. This required new victims. In the stone room lay the lifeless bodies of the beastmen, and the devil's stone was draining their life force. Thanks to that power, the stone activated its own might. Meanwhile, something strange was happening in the palace of another kingdom. The Beast King learned from his servant that strange events had begun in the forest, something that had not happened there in the last 10 years, and he was greatly surprised. He knew the kingdom of Epirus had placed a cursed eye on this forest, destroying many sacred beasts and plunging the woods into darkness. Over the last 200 years, neighboring states were also devastated, and only Sparrow sacrificed tens of thousands of lives for the sake of defense. The servant, hearing this, told the king he would not give in to fear. The king knew only humans could commit such cruel acts. If they seized the world, the Entour kingdom would be destroyed, and that realization weighed on him. He silently prayed to God to save them from disaster. Meanwhile, a dark-haired boy woke up in the mountains. Tenno stepped out of the cave. Looking up at the clear sky, his mood immediately lifted as a lively pack of wolves gathered around him, and Fenrir woke up nearby. The white wolf's actions caught the young man's attention, and he watched it for a long time, wondering where the pack would go after the forest was cleared. Suddenly, Tenno called to the silver wolf. Fenrir turned, and the boy, speaking as leader, asked whether the pack wanted to go with him. Hearing the boy's question, Fenrir studied him for a moment with a piercing look. Tenno smiled, assuming the silver wolf hadn't understood. Still, the young man decided to give them names, starting with the wolf he met first. From then on, the silver beast was called Cow. Next, he named the two who had the same silver fur as Cow, calling one Owl and the other Hio. 2 males followed, one black and one white. The black was named Shion, and the white Kuro. The white one looked more like a dog than a wolf and was given the short name T. After he named the entire flock, a small bird caught his eye, and he named her Karen for her pretty wings and sweet chirping. Tenno was proud of himself. He thought he was good at making up names. His sister always disagreed, but Tenno did not want to think about it. Karen chirped happily, pleased with her name. The boy snapped out of his thoughts and came back to reality. Fenrir watched him quietly and intently. The silver wolf was truly glad to receive a name. They were not ordinary wolves. Their real name was Fenrils. Fenrir's followers asked their king who this young man was, since he had even given them names, and the whole pack was stunned because nothing like it had ever happened in their history. Indeed, to accept someone who wields magic that banishes evil and heals as their master. By saving them, Tenno became more to the pack than a savior. The wolves soon noticed their strength returning, so according to Cow, they would now obey Tenno as their master. The silver Fenrir then turned to T, not one of their kind, wanting to hear his opinion because T was not a wolf. Tai had earlier found refuge with them, so he could not go back on that decision. Tenno was the one who first mistook him for a dog. Cow finally announced the decision. From then on, they would repay the boy with service and loyalty. At that moment, Tenno asked Cow to find a source of water, but suddenly fell silent. Surprised, the young man found the whole pack staring at him, making him falter awkwardly as he repeated that he only wanted to find water. Shion and Kuro enthusiastically volunteered to show their master the place with water. They were keen to please him. Tenno froze at their resolve, but Shion and Kuro were already far down the slope, so the boy had to hurry after them. Startled by the steep drop, he ran downhill screaming in fear, which sent one Fenril racing after him. Soon they all went down and were among the trees. The Fenrils did not stop for a moment, hurrying to bring the boy to the spring, and Tenno was surprised they had even gone beyond the barrier. Eventually they came to a water source, but when Tenno saw it, he grew grim, stunned to find the water tainted by darkness. The water gurgled with pollution, a foul mist rising above it. The young man stood motionless, overwhelmed by the terrible sight. He wanted to tell Kuro and Shion this place was dangerous, but he couldn't say it aloud when he saw the expectant look in their eyes. The boy started to say that even cleaning wouldn't help, but he stopped again halfway through. He didn't dare upset the wolves because Shion and Kuro were hoping for praise. Their sincerity touched Tenno. Smiling awkwardly, He patted their heads and praised them for helping. His words of thanks pleased the animals a little. The boy smiled, but tears glistened in his eyes because he knew he couldn't last long without water and rest. At that moment, Fenrir stepped forward eagerly, insisting on praise. Tenno laughed and praised each of them again. Eventually, the whole pack gathered around. Tenno walked, barely lifting his feet, and quietly apologized that he could not drink that water. A spring of clean water inside the barrier would be welcome. The boy was exhausted and longed for a sip of real freshness. Exhausted from thinking about water, he suddenly felt a warm glow in his palm. At the same moment, clear water appeared in his hand, summoned by his magic. It was enough to imagine water, and it appeared in his hand. Tenno smiled as he realized he had this power and gratefully examined the clear moisture on his palm. A thought came to the boy that if he could summon water, he might also be able to create food if he wanted it strongly enough. To test it, he immediately tried to summon gyudon with an egg and soy sauce, and Tenno got excited, already picturing himself enjoying the meal. The magic failed. The food he had pictured did not appear. Silence fell, and the Fenrils looked at him as if waiting for an answer. Blushing and coughing awkwardly, Tenno quickly changed the subject, thinking it was probably impossible to call up dishes as if from a restaurant, but the boy kept going. This time he decided to call out individual ingredients and loudly said, "Cabbage." Once again, nothing happened. The cabbage still did not appear, and the boy felt even more awkward while the animals watched him, not understanding what he was doing. Still determined, he tried to summon a chicken wing and an apple. There was no result this time either. No food appeared, and Tenno sank to the ground, tired, annoyed and disappointed since summoning the provisions was pointless. Then it hit him that he might not be able to create things that do not exist in this world, and the only option left was to look for food nearby. The boy used the mountain as a landmark, so he would not get lost in the forest. Deciding to search the area on foot, he looked for food. He especially hoped to find fruit trees. On his way, he saw mushrooms but did not touch them, afraid they were poisonous. The search continued, and with the pack he combed the forest for food. He looked carefully at the trees but found no fruit. The forest had only ordinary trees with no flowers or fruit. Sighing, Tenno realized he had only wasted his strength and was now hungry. Just then, the silver wolf Hio gently nudged him from behind. The wolf tried to get his attention. The boy looked at him, surprised and a little sad, not understanding what he was doing. Meanwhile, Kuro, Shion, and Hio exchanged glances and made an instant decision. All three immediately ran off. The boy was stunned. He didn't know where they'd gone and only watched them until they faded into the distance. Then Tenno turned to Kao and pointed out that the wolves were fleeing. But Fenrir only gave a long, soothing howl and showed no sign of alarm. It instantly calmed the boy. This singing even cheered him, though he still didn't understand anything. Kao kept watching the young man with his intense gaze. Tenno thought the silver wolf might finally be thinking about his pack's well-being. To reassure him, the boy said the wolves would come back, and meanwhile they would look for a few more supplies. Still worried about the three who had disappeared, he moved on with the pack and kept searching for food among the tall trees. His stomach rumbled loudly with hunger. Tenno realized this was becoming a serious problem, since he had found nothing. Unsure what to do next, he noticed the world had no flowers or fruit. While thinking about survival, something nearby caught his attention. He found a new cave. Joy lit up inside him, and the boy examined the discovery with curiosity. Remembering the previous cave had been too tight with a narrow exit, Tenno was glad this space looked suitable for a camp, but he told himself to be cautious. First, he cast a spell to scan the cave. Light filled the space, and the young man saw that it was surprisingly spacious. Inside, he noticed a passage leading up 2 or 3 stories high. Tenno was completely captivated by the sight of this cave. Suddenly, he felt something and stopped his clairvoyance. Right in front of him lay a huge, fallen, demonic boar, and nearby Shion, Kuro, and Hio were howling with joy. Tenno froze, stunned by what he saw. A giant wild boar lay before him, soaked in darkness, and he cried out in surprise. Only then the boy realized that 3 wolves had gone hunting, and Shion, Kuro, and Hio howled proudly to confirm his guess. Tenno was touched by the charming sight. the three wolves looking unexpectedly endearing, but when he glanced at the prey, he recoiled in horror because a disgusting demonic boar lay before him, and its appearance killed any appetite. Unable to refuse his three hunters, he knew they had gone hunting for him, and their efforts could not be ignored, so he resigned himself to eating the boar. Hio looked at him with eyes full of expectant praise, and Tenno felt his heart melt. He hugged all three wolves tightly, and Shion, Kuro, and Hio contentedly enjoyed his affection. The boy was happy to pet his new friends, but he knew a far less pleasant task awaited him, butchering the demonic boar's carcass. Having thanked the hunters, Tenno set to work, first casting a spell to cleanse the prey of darkness while picturing it as a powerful vacuum cleaner that sucked the curse out to the last drop. The darkness was too thick, and cleansing came slowly. He focused, trying to dispel everything soaked in the curse. At last, the black energy evaporated and left the boar's body. Tenno sighed with relief and moved on to the next stage. He began preparing the meat to make it suitable for the dish. Once he cleaned it, it gleamed with a juicy shine and even made the wolves' mouths water. The pack was delighted with their master. Examining the carcass, Tenno saw it resembled a common boar, but was clearly a magical beast, which made him think his companions might also have a magical nature. The moment he met their innocent, gentle gazes, all his doubts disappeared. They seemed too simple and sincere. He decided he was probably wrong, that they were just ordinary, cute wolves without any hidden magical powers. Hungry wolves stared at the meat, and Tenno realized they would not eat it raw, so he would have to cut up the carcass himself, which did not please the boy. Noticing Hio's hopeful look, he had to repeat that he would definitely try the meat, which pleased his favorite. His eyes dropped back to the cleaned carcass, and he stood frozen, unsure where to begin cutting it up. Trying to calm himself, he decided he was not ready yet, and chose to freeze the meat so it would not spoil. Remembering his refrigerator in his home world and the expensive strawberries he had bought with his salary, he felt sad. Focusing, he cast a spell of cold. In an instant, the huge boar carcass froze over. Steam rose from it, and the wolves stared at the frozen meat in surprise. They looked at the young man questioningly, but Tenno just sighed with relief. The freezing was over. Next, he had to remove the fluids inside. Just thinking about it made his body tremble with disgust. He lacked the courage to do the job. He decided to use magic and imagined the bodily fluids were just ordinary water that could be easily wiped away. There was a risk. The meat could dry out completely. He decided to first peek inside the carcass using magic. What he saw disgusted him. The vision made his legs give way, and he sank to his knees, feeling completely defeated by the sight. The wolves grew worried about him and thought he did not like the meat, since he had frozen the carcass while they preferred it fresh. They looked at their master sadly, feeling they had not served him well. Meanwhile, Tenno tried to figure out how to get rid of the blood. He decided to carry the jars outside and burn them. He decided to try this method and got ready to act. Using magic, he began to put his plan into action. One of the wolves even thought their master had no fangs, so he would not be able to eat on his own. Hio, Shion, and Kuro wanted him to give the order so they could tear the corpse apart for him, but the young man used teleportation magic instead. In an instant, all of the boar's blood vessels were exposed. The wolves salivated at the sight of such a feast. To their horror, Tenno set the ships ablaze with magical fire and destroyed everything. The Fenrils were stunned. They watched him in silence, wide-eyed, as the young man noticed the flame had slightly singed the top of the meat. The young man realized that scraping away the outer dirt was easy, but a tougher task awaited him because he had to remove the boar's entrails and wash them thoroughly. Earlier, Tenno had only worked with fish, so he did not know which parts to remove from a large animal. He began to run through the internal organs in his head. The thought suddenly turned his stomach, so he pushed away the images of organs and used teleportation magic to avoid it. In the next moment, the boar's insides spilled out. The wolves smelled the appetizing scent and, unable to hold back, began to drool. The boy used the flame again and burned everything to ashes. The wolves backed away in fear, not understanding why he did it. Tenno could not stand the smell, and though he removed the useless parts, he was still dissatisfied. Next time he decided to do it with his eyes closed, which further stunned the wolves. He realized something important. He could cool and freeze and could also burn, so he had actually mastered the basics of elemental magic. Wanting to cut the meat, he asked the wolves to step back, and when he looked at them, he noticed some seemed upset by his actions. Focused, he used air magic to cut the carcass, slicing the meat with quick, sharp movements. The pieces lay in front of him. All that remained was to remove the skin from the portions. Tenno chose one piece for himself and needed to cook it well, or he would not be able to eat it. He offered the rest to Cow and the others. The king cheerfully let the hunters who had caught the game take their portions first. Shion, Kuro, and Hio eagerly dug into the meat. Then T approached Cow and asked to be given some of the meat after it was divided. Cow readily agreed and promised to share with him. As long as T stayed with the pack, they would support him. They were all in the same situation now. T praised Cow for his wisdom, but Cow reminded them that he too had once been king of his pack. Tai did not see himself as a king. Having failed to protect his comrades, he felt he had no right to that title. Only the hope of finding at least a few survivors remained. Cow reminded him that his name also came from Tenno, and that he was now called Chai. That thought lifted his spirits and gave him strength. At that moment, a sudden cry rang out. The boy had burned his hands. His palms were scorched by an accidental touch to the meat. He stared grimly at his own fingers. Sighing, Tenno asked the wolves for a piece of meat. He felt sorry about the wasted food. Last time he had burned the entrails, and this time he lost part of the kill. Trying a new method, he laid the meat on a stone, pictured it as grill grates, and carefully used fire magic. The meat slowly began to fry, giving off a savory smell, and Tenno was glad that this time the piece hadn't burned and was cooking slowly and properly. Meanwhile, the wolves greedily tore into their prey, and then a new scent drifted through the air, incredibly delicious, and unlike anything they had smelled before. The whole pack looked up at once, stopped eating, and rushed toward the boy who was grilling a piece of meat. Fully ready, steam rose from him, tempting even the most restrained. Tenno was glad his choice to use the stone had proved right. The meat was well roasted. The wolves stared and drooled, and Tenno took it from the fire with a sharp wooden stick. He skewered the hot piece onto it using a stick as a skewer. Although the meat was a bit tough, he was satisfied with the result. The young man saw the meal was slightly burned, but was not upset, because what mattered was that he had real food and wanted to try it right away. Taking the first bite, he felt happiness spread through his body. The meat was surprisingly tasty, and Tenno was relieved to finally satisfy his hunger. He kept eating and refused to share with his chick because she could not eat it. Not far from them, another cave lay in shadow. Dark energy radiated from it. The damp air made drops fall to the ground, and inside someone listened quietly to the sounds outside. Tenno was stunned to find his little bird had turned out to be a mammal, and Karen began pecking at the boar meat with ease. After everyone had eaten, the boy and his pack decided to check the new place for safety. He searched the cave from top to bottom and found no threats. No signs of previous occupants were found here either. Tenno decided to set up the main room on the cave's upper level, which felt like a 4-story villa compared to his old place. They were now on the lower floor. He was pleased because the space felt very open and the high ceiling impressed him. More space opened up ahead, and something in the distant wall was glowing. Despite his curiosity, he sensed no living creatures. This floor felt safe too, but the lower level made him uneasy, and using clairvoyance, he saw something he could not make out below. Haunted by the thought of how long the barrier would hold, Tenno grew serious at once because the darkness would return sooner or later. He sighed deeply. He had to check what was happening downstairs anyway, even though he did not want to go at all. Upset, he held Cow close. The silver wolf gently steadied him, and the boy thanked it for the warmth. Relieved, he headed down with the pack. Heading down, Tenno stepped carefully to avoid tripping on the rocks, while the wolves went ahead, peering warily into the darkness. At last they reached the lower level. Cow growled and bared his fangs as a thick darkness swirled right in front of them. Tenno was stunned. Even after his massive cleansing, so much cursed energy still remained here. Fenrir let out a low, threatening growl at the sight of the darkness. The flock and the boy stared tensely at the dark clump. Suddenly, a smaller part broke off and began moving toward them. The Fenrils immediately growled and moved in to shield their master, while the frightened Tenno quickly cast a cleansing spell. The darkness did not lift. It pushed hard against the barrier, trying to break through. The boy realized his magic had failed this time. Suddenly, the mass melted away. Tenno froze, then heard a dull thud as something hit the cave floor. Only then did he realize the cleansing had worked, though it was late. Darkness had vanished. The boy looked around, trying to understand what remained of that mass. Remembering that this had happened to Karen, he feared something might emerge from the darkness, and when he looked down, he saw a spider. The boy leaned in for a closer look and stared in amazement at the strange creature. It was a spider with wings. Another dark energy swirled beside it, and Tenno immediately tried to cleanse it. The spell worked, and the darkness faded. The spider was stunned to see that a human could banish the gloom. The boy noticed darkness bursting up from beneath the ground, and during the cleansing it began to evaporate quickly from the room. From the leftover black mass, a large spider and more than 20 small ones emerged. Tenno was surprised. In this world, spiders were a kind of magical creature, not mere bugs. Besides, they had wings, so maybe they were not spiders at all. That thought gave him pause, but he never found an answer. Suddenly, the silver wolf approached the magical creatures. Cow noted that only one large member was still alive, which surprised Tenno. At that moment, the giant spider spread its wings and rose into the air, flying straight toward the boy. Fear gripped Tenno. A spider landed right on his head. Although it was unpleasant, the boy did not brush it off. The little spiders moved on. They easily jumped onto Shion, and the black wolf froze at the sensation of spiders clinging to his fur. He spun to shake them off as Tenno looked on in confusion, and Tenno later realized they meant no harm. Soon they climbed to the cave's second level. Tenno noted it was fairly spacious here too, but they had to check every corner. Tenno remembered that earlier he had only said the spell and it had worked, though he didn't fully understand how. His sister's words came to mind. To use magic, you need a clear image in your mind, but in practice it proved much harder. Deciding to test the theory, he tried to summon fire without forming any image in his mind. Nothing happened, and his palm stayed empty. Then he pictured nothing once more, but this time he cast the water summoning spell. A splash came the next moment. A puddle formed behind him. Pausing as he saw it, he tried to picture a flame, and this time a fire sprang up on his palm. The wolves stared at their master in surprise, a flame flickering on his hand. Tenno did not understand why water acted differently. He tried again and produced fire once more. The flame appeared again, and he noticed he could hold it even in midair. The new magic depended on a clear image. If an image and a spell combined even once, they stuck in his memory, and later it was enough to say the words without straining his imagination. That mattered because continuous concentration exhausted him. Suddenly the fire swung aside, and the boy realized a draft through a crack in the wall had pushed the flames in a different direction. Tenno peered through the gap, but despite its width he saw nothing, and did not sense any dark energy. He decided to light the crack with a fireball, but the fire was too bright and blinded everyone for a moment. The young man realized he had gone too far. Seeing the wolves gently cover their eyes with their paws moved him. He smiled sheepishly and asked to be forgiven. He tried making the ball smaller, but it became too dim, so he brightened it again. After that, the boy collapsed onto the floor, exhausted. Casting precise spells drained him. The wolves watched him with worry and awe. Refreshed, he peered into the crack again. The fireball revealed the glow of some glittering stones inside. A winged spider darted into the crack. It grabbed a small piece of rock and flew back. The spider landed on the boy's palm and put the shiny find into his hand. Tenno was delighted by the beauty of the silvery stone. He sincerely thanked the spider and even called it the leader of spiders. The spider just watched him in silence. Then, as if embarrassed, it hid in his hair. The boy watched in surprise, realizing he had accidentally called it the leader of the spiders. Wolves quickly drew his attention, their eyes fixed on the crystal in his palm. The young man decided the stone was truly rare and put it in his pocket. Later he wondered whether similar stones might be found on the upper floors, but decided to leave that for later, and the Fenrir were surprised by his calm. After confirming there were no further cracks, he finished checking the cave. Pulling things from the bag, the young man found only a wallet and a few papers. He felt sad because he had hoped to find something more useful, since his phone was gone. After inspecting the new shelter, Tenno made a plan to search for people and still needed to decide where to sleep. Sleeping on the hard floor was unbearable. His body went numb by morning. Longing for something soft, he then realized he could use magic to polish the floor. The pack watched in surprise. The boy blushed under their stares, but soon eagerly smoothed not just the floor, but the walls. The wolves were stunned. Their owner had turned the stone cave into a comfortable, cozy place, and Cow gave an approving growl, accepting it as his new home. Others beat him and ran inside first, but the floor was so smooth they slipped and almost fell. Tenno looked embarrassed, and Cow felt awkward at how clumsy he seemed. He realized that precision magic takes real skill. Meanwhile, dark energy tried again to force its way through the barrier, but the defenses held. The winged spider watched from afar. Long ago, winged spiders ruled the hellfire. They could withstand the flames and drag prey into lava from the earth's depths, and their clan kept everyone in fear. Anyone who saw them was doomed to die. They were called the Wardens of Destruction, the Kirini. Now only one adult of the whole species remained alive, and the others had turned into small, winged spiders, their reduced form. They spent nearly all their magic protecting their offspring and miraculously survived. The spider could not understand why it had not disappeared under such powerful magic. Suddenly it heard someone call it Chureni. It was the Fenrir's king, a silver wolf. Cow recognized the old TRNA in him and sneered that he was now far smaller than he had been. TRNA bristled at the remark. He demanded an explanation for why the dark magic, the scent of which had soaked the whole forest, had suddenly vanished. Spider also wanted to know if Tenno was truly human, and Fenrir confirmed he was. But it was this young man's strength that saved everyone. TRNA refused to believe it because humans had destroyed the forest. The boy's magic was different, so the Spider clan unanimously acknowledged him as their master. The Fenrils were surprised, since they had always prided themselves on their independence. Ka warned that if the spiders try to harm their master, they will hear his terrible roar. The spider had no intention of doing that. Even if they were 100 times stronger, the young man would still surpass them. His magic was bright and restored life. Ka calmed down, but pointed out that this did not mean the Fenrils would give up their rule over the forest. And Churin was irritated by the words. The wolf jokingly told him to rein in his little spiders that were bothering Tai. Shaking after his defeat, he looked dejected. Chureni was surprised to hear the name Chai. Fenrir then proudly explained that their lord had given everyone names, and the spider must now call him Cow. Silver Wolf was proud of his new name, while Chureni recalled the boy calling him Spider, and though embarrassed, was glad. Feeling the lightning's terrible power, he asked Cow about it. The wolf said people were probably fighting again, so their lord had put up a barrier. The spider was stunned. The boy had made that barrier by himself, and at that scale he should have burned out from exhaustion. Cow admitted he wouldn't have lasted that long himself, yet the master remained unharmed, and the spider could not believe it, while Tenno stayed silent and thoughtful. The young man knew no one was nearby. In the days before, he had sent up a drone to scout the area, and all around was endless forest. The forest stretched far in every direction. The boy saw many animals but didn't find a single human dwelling. For a moment, he thought there were no people left in this world, but he pushed the thought aside because there were still places he had not explored. Eventually, he calmed down. His mood improved after setting up his home. With practice, he leveled the floor and walls. He also built stairs between the floors, which helped him hone his teleportation magic. Though the mountain looked ordinary from the outside, inside it became a real villa. The new dwelling had 4 floors and 2 underground levels, with a bedroom on the top floor, a food storage room in the first basement, and a cave with stones in the second. No one could appreciate those efforts. The wolves, wagging their tails, patiently waited for praise and brought back fresh prey. Tenno picked a piece of meat and used magic to move the wooden cutting board into place. The other Fenrils pounced on the prey and scrambled to tear it open. Realizing they preferred raw meat, the young man saw that frying it had been useless and remembered how the wolves, fearing he would burn the entrails again, grabbed them and ran off. The boy kept frying the meat himself, but was already tired of it and longed for fish when a silver wolf suddenly stood tense and motionless, catching his attention. Cow stared into the darkness with a threatening snarl. A low growl rumbled from his jaws, and Tenno grew alarmed by the behavior. Coming closer, he saw the cause. Dark energy had torn through the barrier, Spiders braced for battle, and wolves stood frozen, waiting for the shadow's attack. Tenno snapped in anger at the situation. Memories of lightning striking the barrier just last night annoyed him. His shout rolled through the mountains, making even the wolves flinch. They looked at their master, frightened. The boy pulled himself together and calmed down. From the mountaintop, he launched a magical drone, and a monitor showing the forest appeared before him. The screen showed part of the forest already dark, and he recognized the lake he'd seen beyond the barrier yesterday and pinpointed its location. The boy decided to clear the entire area and reinforce the barrier at the same time. Kao was stunned by his master's plan, but Tenno knew that without trying, he would not know if he could. And as Tenno set up his home, he gradually grew used to using magic. He pictured a strip stretching all the way to the lake. Despite the long distance, he felt sure of himself. He directed the cleansing magic at the source of the darkness. Fenrir was shocked and deeply worried that his master was using so much power. The boy did not stop and widened the swath of clearing in every direction, digging into the ground to destroy the darkness hiding there. He then cast a spell to strengthen the barrier, and a bright glow spread around, dispelling the cursed energy. The land cleared of darkness. Tenno smiled with relief. He had boosted his defenses tenfold and felt no fatigue, and instead his body filled with strength. The winged spider declared the young man an endless source of magic no one could defeat, and Kao agreed. The boy noticed the curse had already seeped into the water and could spread further. He decided to install a barrier filter. To be safe, he devised a 3-layer magical filter. Kao was astonished that the master still had the strength for it. Tenno realized someone was placing those curses. Until they are completely gone, he will cleanse the land every day. Smiling, the boy promised the silver wolf they'd go fishing tomorrow. Meanwhile, at the castle of the Kingdom of Sparrow, the city was calm. A dark-haired man was looking out the window when the commander of the 4th Squad of Knights, Esperanza Mizurost, called to him. Standing nearby was Han Milza, commander of the 1st Squad, surprised that Mizurost had returned so early because the task was simple. Nothing unusual happened in the forest. Monsters only appeared from time to time. Mizurost wasn't concerned about security because the country was protected by the strongest barrier. Gon Milza was less calm. The light that had suddenly flashed in the middle of the forest a few days ago and spread in every direction worried him. Using the magic stone, the king ordered a test to find out if this was the forest lord's power, since no such changes had been seen from birth and it was unclear whether he had any followers. Han Milza was surprised, since if this really was the lord, he had somehow kept that much power. And Mizurost fell silent for a moment. He then awkwardly said the number of people and scouts in the area had risen, but he did not see it as a cause for alarm. With their king and mages, they could keep attacking other states for centuries, and a powerful barrier defended the country from outside while knights provided security inside. Mizurost said goodbye to Han and hurried to the baths, leaving the commander of the 1st detachment feeling uneasy. At the center of the world, and the forest, stood the two-eyed eye stone, a source of magic that had long emitted immense power. Many mages died studying it. Because of him, the king and the magicians were able to halt aging. Research continued for centuries, and people aged very slowly. As a child, Gon Milza never thought about it, but now he understood that their rule depended entirely on this stone. On the road, he saw a crowd of beast folk walking with bowed heads, hollow eyes, and exhausted bodies. Marks on their necks showed how they were controlled. Lost in thought, Gon Milza stopped and looked at the sad sight. A cruel old man with a whip trailed behind the creatures, treating them as less than human, and angrily lashing them to drive the slaves on. Gon Milza asked the old man with the whip why there were so many prisoners today. The man immediately grew shy and spoke respectfully. Milza was just passing by when the old man smiled and explained that the number of prisoners has dropped sharply recently, all because of donations. To his joy, the number of victims would soon grow, but Han Milza did not share that joy when she heard this. Gamul, the commander of the 5th Squad, stepped forward. He was the most eager for battle among them. Milza did not like him and immediately noticed his new sword. The king personally gifted him a blade identical to the ruler's, brimming with powerful magic. Gamul wanted to try the weapon on the prisoners. The sword could drain all life from a body. Milza barely held back from stopping him. It was already too late. Gamul approached the crowd. The old man cheerfully announced that these prisoners had been chosen for the ritual. The commander did not care, and with a single blow, killed them all. Gamul laughed, enjoying the feeling. The old man only trembled helplessly as he watched his acts of brutality. Bored, he watched as the prisoners did not even resist. A mage stepped forward and explained that to drain life force with the sword, he had to activate the skill. Gamula was intrigued. Han Milza watched it all in horror, realizing the country had completely gone mad. In the forest, the boy repaired a makeshift fishing rod. Using ordinary rope instead of fishing line, he still hoped it would work. Cow watched him in surprise. The silver wolf stepped closer, and Tenno said he was putting meat on the hook. Then he cast the line in a wide sweep. Smiling, the boy told Cow that as soon as a fish bit, he would catch it. But Kuro was the first to bite, snapping at the meat. The black wolf chewed the piece contentedly, and the boy cried out in despair that it could not be eaten. Shion also wanted the tasty morsel. At last, they headed to the lake. The boy hoped they could catch some fish there. Disappointment met him. The water was poisoned and completely unfit for life. The chance of finding fish here was almost zero. Tenno fell silent, weighed down by gloom. He had been walking here so long he hadn't even thought about it before. Irritated, he cast a cleansing spell on the lake. Frowning, he reached for the water, but the spell was too weak and the curse did not lift. All his earlier efforts failed. It became clear that cleaning the water would be much harder. He placed a barrier over the lake. His plan was to fully isolate the body of water, even the parts deep underground, and then find an effective way to clean it. He could stop the curse from spreading through the air, but he couldn't figure out how to rid the water of the dark corruption. Nothing came to mind, and the boy, in despair, stroked Cow's fur while trying to find an answer. Trying to picture the curse as dirt didn't fit. Then an idea came to him. He pictured the dark water as dirt and the cleaning as a magnet pulling it, and immediately wanted to try it. The boy pictured a magnet pulling mud from the very bottom of the lake, and using absorption magic, he saw the darkness begin to gather into separate patches. The joy quickly turned to disgust as masses of black corruption looked horrific, and meanwhile in the kingdom of Conspiracies, the mages kept watch by the stone. A mage entered the hall and asked the head of the order what was happening with the artifact. He had felt a strange pressure since yesterday. At that moment, a crack appeared in the stone. Meanwhile, Tenno teleported the curse upward and managed to gather all the darkness while the wolves watched in stunned silence. Then he tried to send it to the same place where he had once banished another evil, mixing it with a bit of air and picturing the darkness returned to nothingness. Darkness vanished. Everyone looked at him, amazed. For the first time in a long time, the lake shone with clear water freed from the curse. Tenno stared at the cleared lake with suspicion. Clear water flowed into the river, and now all that remained was to wait for the living creatures to return to the lake. They left the lake happily and headed home, while the head of the mages stood stunned as the devil's stone suddenly flared with a bright light that blinded everyone for a moment. When he came to, he saw in horror that an even bigger crack had appeared on the stone. In the throne room, officials briefed the king on the kingdom's affairs. He listened with boredom. Only one thing mattered to him, what had happened in the forest. His question was about the barrier protecting the territory after yesterday's sacrifices, and he hoped the forest had fallen and the king of the forest was dead. Then the remaining creatures could be destroyed for the good of the state. The king's dark, bloodthirsty face frightened the servant. A knight rushed into the throne room with urgent news that a crack had appeared in the magic stone. A courtier tried to calm the monarch, saying the hall is protected by the country's strongest barrier, and the knight might have been mistaken. The barrier remained intact. After a sudden flash of light, the stone finally cracked. The king, hearing this, grew angry. In an instant, he killed the knight with magic, leaving him no time to realize what had happened. The courtiers fell silent with horror. Han Milza stood stunned by the unimaginable cruelty. Everyone knew it was safer to say nothing. Anyone who tries to offer advice risks death. The commander of the 5th Squad watched the knight's corpse with pleasure. The king summoned the commander of the elite squad. Miserost answered immediately and received orders to enter the forest and find out why it had happened. When the water started rising from the lake, Akiro and Cow ran off while Karen flew ahead to make sure they were safe. and then the water unexpectedly settled back into the lake. The boy dropped to the ground and, relieved, said it was over. Deciding it was time to finish setting up the house, he went inside with the animals, who soon fell asleep. He admired the view from the window of his new home. Cow sat beside him, and Karen, as always, settled on his shoulder. Akiro decided to roast meat in the oven, and the wolf watched with delight. The young man proudly told his friend he now had a real stove that made cooking much easier. And though it was only good for frying meat, the first floor was already the kitchen and dining room. Smiling as he looked out the window, he said the view from the veranda was simply beautiful, and Cow joked that they would not mind trying the fried meat too. Akiro cut off a piece, blew on it to cool it, and tossed it to the wolf, telling him to hold it carefully. Kuro tasted the meat and beamed with happiness. The other wolves immediately surrounded their master, insisting they get some too. The boy answered, flustered, that yes, he could, but only a little. Cha's watchful gaze fell on him. Akiro called him over and smiled, saying he always keeps to himself, but they're friends after all, so he deserves a piece of meat too. T trembled with excitement and asked again whether it was allowed. The master confirmed it, and T brightened. Shion immediately said he would get more next time too. T said happily that he would definitely eat it. The wolves gathered in a circle and greedily pounced on the roasted meat Akiro had prepared. The boy laughed awkwardly and decided he would have to cook more next time. He even had his own bath. When he went in, he said happily that he felt great because the tub had turned out simply amazing. Smiling, the boy said that with magic he could easily make and heat water. Before, he had relied on just a cleansing spell. But a proper bath was a different matter. Admitting it was hard without soap, he saw magic as the only rescue, and built a large bath for himself and the animals, so everyone could bathe. He noticed pensively that they had all put on weight lately, and wondered if they would still fit in the bathtub. His next wish was to have a toilet built. The boy had pictured it, and when it appeared he hugged his creation, almost crying with joy. Whenever he was left alone, Cow ran after him, thinking it unsafe to stay in the forest. Akiro tried to push him away, explaining that he did not have to stay by his side all the time, but the wolf found it hard to accept leaving his master alone. The young man smiled and said the problem was solved. At first he feared the stone would fail, yet the result looked surprisingly like a regular toilet. Cow sat outside the room and heard Akiro say excitedly that everything was simply incredible. Inside there was even a bidet and a self-cleaning system, and the magic impressed him more each time. The wolf burst into the room and cheerfully asked what the owner was doing. The boy screamed in fear, and Cow came out with a very strange look on his face. His friend asked what had happened. Cow replied awkwardly that he now felt the owner hated him because the owner had seen him in such an inappropriate state. Akiro stepped outside, scratched the back of his neck, and said he had to make doors. He got so carried away he built toilets on every floor. While practicing magic, he created many things. Picking up the magic stone, the boy noticed training with the crystal was much harder. Pulling it aside, he said in surprise that it was stretching. Pulling him farther, he said happily he would try to stretch him even more. Cow could not believe Misril was affected by magic, and felt surprised. The boy looked through the clear crystal and said excitedly that it let light through like real glass. Akiro hurried home to test the idea. After fitting the glass into the window frames, he sat on the windowsill and smiled, saying he liked it very much. And because the material was thin and strong, he immediately decided to install the windows in the rock. The boy walked through the house, smiling as he admitted he had overdone it a bit by putting windows on every floor, and added that they could put in wooden floors later since there was plenty of material around. He stepped into the forest and stopped before a tall, perfectly straight tree. A TV show had said the wood must be dried before use. He wondered how old it was. Calling out that it was time to get to work, Akiro quickly used magic to strip the tree of its bark and branches. Focusing on making planks, he found a perfectly straight trunk before him. With a joyful cry, he used wind magic. Getting carried away, he awkwardly realized he'd forgotten to cut off the roots. The planks he'd ended up with still stuck out of the ground. Irritated, he said next time we'll have to fell the tree before cutting it. Then he teleported the pile of boards home. The boy said they now needed to trim the pieces and install the floor, then teleported to the fourth-floor bedroom to begin work. Entering the room, he looked proudly at the boards he had made himself. Rolling up his sleeves, he announced it was time to lay the floor. He pictured an ideal, even floor where every plank gleamed and fit perfectly, and decided it would be easy. Stepping onto the first planks, he realized with disappointment that gaps had opened between them and their thickness varied. Akira sighed in annoyance. The boards were too heavy and huge, and he could not teleport them into place evenly, leaving him deeply disappointed. Annoyed, the young man admitted that nothing was going as he had planned, and that any mistake would ruin the floor. Dropping a few boards, he sat on them and sighed with fatigue. Cow sat on the windowsill and watched his owner closely. The boy got up and decided to take a break. With a stone in hand, he walked down to Cow, who was now standing below watching him. Akira mused aloud that he really needed good knives and wanted to make them from these sturdy silver stones. The young man stretched the crystal until it was as thin as a blade, and when he looked at the finished piece, he was glad he had given it the right shape. He approached the rock, drove his knife into it, and shouted with joy that it worked. But the stone was brittle, so he decided to handle the blades carefully. Smiling, he noted that magic could easily change the shapes of the silver stones. Cow and Karen listened with interest. The boy joked they could even make a pot now and began stretching the material, imagining meals other than meat. He added that he would later need kitchen utensils, hinges for doors and windows, and an exit on the 4th floor. Finally, he showed the doll he had molded from clay, said happily that it had turned out cute, and really enjoyed it because he had not worked with clay in a long time. Bored, Cow let out a loud yawn, while Akira set 3 dolls in a row, picked up a stone and studied it closely, then said thoughtfully that the stone shone as if it could be made into bright eyes. The boy made another doll and placed it beside the others. Picking up the next stone, he smiled and decided to make a few more because he enjoyed the process. Night fell quietly and everyone went to sleep. The dolls remained standing on the windowsill. In the morning, Akira woke up groaning and saw Cow rise from his place. Grumbling that it was morning, the boy asked to sleep a little longer. Suddenly, he noticed the floor was perfectly level and gasped in surprise. Akira couldn't tell who had done it because the boards shone without a single flaw, and then he heard a voice say the whole floor now needed to be finished. Turning around, the boy saw dolls pulling a board. They moved in sync and even had a leader directing them. The dolls measured the length, and when something did not fit, one of them cut off the extra with a knife Akira had once made, so the floor turned out perfectly even. The wolves kept glancing between the new residents and the owner, and the boy, turning away from Cow's stare, said awkwardly that he did not know how it happened. But now there were 9 of them. Akira, confused, asked himself whether these were the same dolls he had made yesterday and why they were moving, while they were already dragging a new board to finish the job. Awkwardly, the boy remembered that while making them, he had thought of the fairy tale about the shoemaker's elves, and as he fell asleep, he vaguely imagined how nice it would be if the floor could finish itself. Shock ran through him, so everything had happened because of his thoughts. Opening the door to the next room, he found a single doll sitting alone on the windowsill. Taking her in his arms, he said sadly that she was probably like that because he had imagined nothing when he made her. Then he returned to the others pulling the boards. He shouted for them to stop and called everyone to assemble. The dolls ran up at once and lined up in a single row, waiting for his orders. He realized, bewildered, that they were really listening to him. The dolls watched him intently, and he placed the lonely doll beside the others. He told her firmly that she was now a helper robot and had to start moving. The doll stood up and joined her friends, waving her arms happily. The boy smiled as she moved like she was alive. He said he was counting on her, and the dolls immediately scattered to continue their work. Akira said happily that it was perfect because they were fast, nimble, and cute, which would make his job much easier. The wolves sat behind, tense and watchful. Fear made them howl, saying these were golems, the same ones people used in war. Cow growled harshly, ordering them to calm down. One doll stepped toward the wolf and reached to touch him. The wolf pulled away, and Akira laughed, calling it a funny scene and hoping they would all get used to living together. The young man happily noted that the dolls had already laid out 23 boards. Free from hard work, he decided to continue exploring the forest. Stepping outside, he heard the wolves call out happily that they were going hunting and would bring back plenty of meat. Akira smiled and waved after them. Cow stayed with him. With Karen, they went deeper into the forest to look for vegetables and spices. The boy said thoughtfully that darkness still lingered farther from the mountains. Deciding to cleanse her on the road, Akira looked up at the sky and thought the curse appears where light breaks through and keeps returning. Annoyed, he waved his hand and said it was his problem, then smiled at his friends and added that the forest is much more beautiful now than when he first came here. He then asked Cow what he thought, and Cow suddenly looked up and, delighted, said he could see the fruit that had just ripened on the trees. The boy sighed happily and touched the trunk, but he sadly realized he could not climb that high on his own, and after searching so long it felt unfair. Suddenly a spider leaped out of the trunk. Akira, pleasantly surprised, said it could climb. One by one, other spiders began to appear behind it. The young man counted in shock and realized there were 8 of them. On closer inspection, he saw they had no wings, and he thought with surprise that they might be their young. He kept thinking that not even a week had passed since the first meeting, and they'd already grown so fast, though it might only have seemed that way to him. Akira laughed. Maybe it was only imagination, but Cow seemed even bigger, almost 2 meters tall. At that moment, a fruit fell to the ground. Someone had climbed up and taken it. He picked up the fruit and examined it closely. Akira said it was edible. Its bright red color suggested it was sweet, so animals probably eat it too. A young man cut open the fruit and looked with delight at the juicy flesh, which looked unusually appetizing, and after tasting a piece, tears of joy filled his eyes as he said it was delicious. Wiping away tears, he said he hadn't tasted fruit in so long and felt incredibly happy. It was crisp like a peach, ripe and sweet. He shared it with the spiders, the little bird, and didn't forget Cow. They had gathered a whole mountain of fruit. Akira smiled at the forest's fragrant gifts, but Cow hesitantly said they had probably gone a bit too far, and the boy asked, puzzled, what to do with it now. He tried to put the fruits into the bag, but only one fit. Tired, he joked that the bag was turning into Pac-Man's mouth, and then it really did. All 30 fruits fit, and the bag still looked small. The boy was glad. Magic is unpredictable. An awkward laugh escaped him. They moved on and came across a patch of cabbage. They gathered some, and at that moment the wolves drove wild boars toward him, trying to be helpful. The boy shouted that they had returned, and the wolves howled in response. Akira smiled and noted that their catch had been unusually successful today. He asked with curiosity whether anyone had been hurt. The wolf proudly urged their master to look at the prey he and the owl had brought. Akira hugged him and said happily that he could see everything. The boy tipped the bag and spilled out all the fruits and vegetables. He awkwardly admitted he hadn't expected so many. The wolves eyed the new food with curiosity. The young man realized he could make his food much more varied even without salt. He took off his jacket and, with eagerness, said it was time to get to work. First, he drained the blood, cut the carcass with a knife, used air magic to open it, and then carefully began cutting it into pieces. Laying the pieces on the ground, he loudly told the wolves they could help themselves, and Akira pointed to the foul-smelling boar innards and asked if they wanted them. He split all the meat into 2 parts, some for the current meal and the rest for storage. The wolf said happily that the owner had cut excellent, easy-to-eat pieces. T cheerfully said he had eaten his fill of liver. Akira looked at the pile of meat and sighed. It was already cramped by the house. When he has salt, he will cure the ham and learn how to tan the hide. He carried the meat down to the cellar, smiling that he'd set up cold storage on the lowest floor. Fruits and vegetables probably shouldn't be kept here, so he'll find another place later. Karen watched the roasted meat, licking her lips. Akira approached and thanked her for keeping an eye on everything. The bird seemed to like the roasted meat best. Karen chirped happily. Akira said it was already nicely browned. Even raw, the vegetable was sweet. It was like both cabbage and lettuce with a soft core. The boy picked up a bright green fruit and a knife, cut it, and inhaled a refreshing, tart scent, saying it would be good poured over grilled meat. He wrapped a piece of meat in a cabbage leaf and said with a smile that it was a real treat. The cabbage's sweetness and light tang gave the dish a wonderful flavor. The boy said he only wanted to point out that it was incredibly tasty. Even plain meat needed sauce. Meanwhile, everyone except Karen had grown several sizes, and he wondered what had happened to the real spiders. Akira climbed to the first floor where the dolls were working and, pleased, said they were doing a great job, as they had already reached the kitchen, and he thought the first floor was finished in just 3 days. Lifting the board, he told the dolls to make him a bed now. They could build it from a box measuring 200 by 160. The dolls gathered and began to discuss. Meanwhile, the young man went into the forest. Cheerfully, he said food and shelter were settled, and only one thing remained, then called the spider loudly. Suddenly, a spider appeared, much larger than before, and Akira, surprised, thought it had grown and felt a little uneasy inside. The spider happily called the master to look, saying that thanks to the master's generosity and magic, the body had been restored, and that the spider and his children were deeply grateful to the master. He worried that creating the barrier and the golems was using too much of his energy, since all that control probably weighed on him. Leaning closer, the boy smiled and thought he'd like to tell him something. They turned out to be genuinely intelligent and surprisingly friendly. The young man remembered and said he had wanted to ask because he was always wearing worn-out clothes and had to wash them every day, which had become a problem. Clenching his fist, he thought confidently that spiders spin webs, wondering why he had not realized it before, and now he truly wanted new clothes instead of his old rags. Curious, the boy asked the spider whether it knew of a creature that produces long threads. The spider looked at him closely, but stayed silent. Akira was surprised that the other had really understood him. He and his friends followed the spider. A smile crossed his face as he thought Kao had stayed home this time, so they would go together. He cheerfully told Kuro and Chai he was counting on them. Kuro said happily they had been chosen to accompany their master. Chai just grumbled that if he's the master, they must. Tai thought this was a chance to prove himself like Ko usually does. He said loudly that he had to live up to their trust. Akira asked the spider where it was leading them. Suddenly they saw caterpillars, huge ones, and everyone screamed in fear. Akira feared the spider had led them here out of spite. The spider picked up the caterpillars and cheerfully asked if they would suit the master. The wolf, frightened, asked if they were poisonous because that would be dangerous. The spider said that if you leave them alone, nothing will happen. But one caterpillar shot a thread straight at Akira. Akira covered his face with his hands and screamed. The wolves and the spider shrieked too. The spider, in despair, asked the caterpillar what she was doing. Akira looked at his hand tangled in threads and admitted he had briefly thought he was under attack. It was not what he had imagined, but the threads were strong enough to use, and he thanked the spider sincerely. Relieved, the spider said he was ready to accept any punishment from the master. The wolves stared at him in horror, some even crying with fear. Kuro said in disappointment that they had not managed at all. Akira smiled and asked the spider for permission to take a few caterpillars home. They were put on the wolves, which felt humiliated. The spider said he had warned the children not to spit out the venom, so there was nothing to worry about. Tai kept muttering that they were just insects. Just insects. Akira awkwardly apologized to Kuro and T. In the end, they returned home. Ko smiled and asked Chai to explain why he kept talking about insects as if he were wound up, and the wolf squealed in fear that nothing had happened. Akira hugged Ko, said he was glad to see him again, and asked him to do something nice. Chai was stunned by what had happened to him. The young man entered the house and loudly announced his return. Earlier, while building the bath and the cold room, he had noticed that a stone in the cave collected magic and held it for a long time. He proudly declared that the floor cleansed itself and no dirt remains, then announced the second floor was free and they would set up the incubator there. He dumped a pile of leaves and said they only needed airing. Placing 2 caterpillars inside, he noted the food would last a long time. Akira looked at the 2 golems and said someone would have to take care of them now. He could not be there all the time. The dolls all raised their hands, ready to take on the job. The boy happily agreed to look after the caterpillars. They curled up among the leaves in fear. Akira was surprised to see they were frightened, but also very cute. Pulling off the t-shirt, he studied it closely, thinking how to make the fabric, and said they would now have threads. The dolls took the shirt and called for another. The other one quickly waved her arms and straightened it so it could be worn. Akira said in surprise that it had turned out even better than he had expected, then asked the doll how the bed was coming along. The doll grabbed his hand and led him into another room. Seeing the huge bed, the boy cried out in delight that they had finished in just half a day. Akira said proudly that they were nearing civilized life. The dolls returned his proud look because that was their job. The boy said he wanted the night to come sooner. As evening fell, he said goodnight to everyone and got into bed, covering himself with his jacket. He could not get comfortable, so he called Ko. Curling up against the wolf, he thought it was as soft as a mattress, even better. Akira entered the room and stared at the work, surprised to find it almost finished and to realize the stone dolls were getting more skilled. The young man was surprised to find that just yesterday the walls had been bare, and as he sat at the table and pushed back a chair, he noticed the furniture looked like the stylish pieces he'd seen online. The doll placed a plate of meat on the table and set chopsticks beside it. Akira called out happily that they were chopsticks. Then someone else brought a glass of water. He tasted it and smiled, feeling pure bliss in its simple, homely flavor. Even though the meat and water were the same, they tasted twice as good. Jikiro turned his head and watched the puppets at work. He was surprised to see there were 8 now and guessed the other 2 were in the caterpillar room. Akira tried on his new clothes. He called out happily that he now had a jacket. Touching the fabric, Akira said he had a green blazer and black pants. With childlike delight, he declared they were smooth as silk and sat before a pile of leaves and fruit, thoughtfully wondering whether the color of the threads really depends on what caterpillars eat. Turning his head, he smiled and brightened when he saw the key role look over the new clothes. Excited, he said that even a few sets of underwear were already ready. Akira flushed with shame as everyone looked at him. Approaching the doll that sat by the loom, he joined the others gathered around it. The boy said in surprise that they had built a loom he had only seen on TV. It was handmade and incredible, though a bit scary. They went outside. Akira said happily that he felt so light, as if success was already waiting ahead. Wolves ran beside them. The boy smiled at Ko and said he wanted to look for spices. Salt can be extracted from special stones. He should start by finding out whether this world has a sea. Stepping onto the soft earth, he stopped before a new cave, peered inside, and said they had found another entrance. Akira was surprised, because he did not remember the place, and Ko said nervously that it was strange that such a large hole next to the house had gone unnoticed. They moved inside. Akira noted the slope here was gentle, but he felt traces of a curse. Calling for light, the boy caused magic to illuminate the cave and warned Ko to move carefully. They pushed deeper. Before the next passage, Akira said tensely that the cave was widening. Strange noises came from inside. Ko growled, and the boy worried about what it might be. They went in and saw bats on the ceiling and giant ants on the floor. Akira screamed in terror, demanding to know what was happening as a single ant crawled closer, and the boy began crying in fear and screamed hysterically because they were surrounded by giant ants. Ku let out a loud roar. Akira shouted that Ko had grown huge too. A real confrontation began before him between the wolf and the giant ant. The boy went pale. There was no time to stand still. He shouted for cleansing, but the ant relentlessly advanced on him and his friends. The young man cried in despair that the cleansing had failed and only the barrier caught fire. An ant leaped high and dove down on him from above. Akira froze in terror, closed his eyes and waited for the worst. At the last moment, Ko stepped in front of him, ready to take the blow. The wolf bit the ant's leg and tossed it aside. Akira jumped up and saw that the other insects were covered in black liquid. Ants turned against the wolves, preparing to defend themselves. Akira thought of those dark spots and felt a bad premonition. Wolves shielded him, the barrier held, but the tension stayed high. Ants banged their heads against the defense, trying to break through. The boy relaxed when the barrier held. Ko roared so fiercely that his fur stood on end. Akira was tormented, wondering why the cleansing had failed. Looking closely at the insects, he saw that the black spots on their bodies looked just like the grime that once covered Ko's fur and his pack. Akira realized the curse had likely taken full control of their bodies, so they had to find a way to drive it out, or they would not survive. Ku growled because one ant had already broken through the barrier. Kuro cried out in horror because it had jumped right onto the boy. Akira turned away and called out, "No." The barrier suddenly flashed and knocked the ant away. Ko grew even angrier when he saw his master in danger. Akira shouted that it didn't match, so the body contained two beings instead of one. They looked possessed, as if demons had moved in. He kept thinking it was like invisible chains binding their souls, and then he said he understood that they had to destroy the curse that had captured their minds. Akira reached forward and loudly ordered the darkness to leave. The ants glowed as the curse began to leave their bodies. Black spots disappeared one by one. The ant thought bitterly that black magic had poisoned the river and the tree's fruit. Forest kings fought, but their resistance weakened and people did not hear their pleas. He said new monsters were appearing everywhere, once again plunging the forest into darkness. The darkness wrapped around their souls and bodies, and they themselves became monsters, enemies of their own home. The ant whispered that even the king of the forest was powerless here. Turning to the dragon sleeping in the waters, he asked for help, closed his eyes, and fell silent forever. When he opened his eyes again, he saw Akira, and the boy leaned over, touched Akira's head, and said happily that it felt so smooth. Muraka froze, not understanding what was happening. Ko explained that it was still him, fully restored. Muraka asked if he really was King Fenrir. They moved on after him. Akira looked up and saw ants crawling across the ceiling. As he stumbled and nearly fell, an insect saved him. The boy smiled and thanked it. Glancing at the ant, he remembered Ko saying it was fine, and after half an hour it looked completely normal, though it might not be as safe as the spider. The ant suddenly stopped and looked to the side. Akira asked, surprised, whether they had arrived. Akira called for light, and the cave lit up. Ku asked if this was the water dragon's home. Muraha confirmed that a sacred lake once stood here, full of magical power, but now only its shadows remain. Akira touched the barrier and said angrily that the curse was spreading again. Ordering it to vanish, he thought maybe other creatures were suffering like this ant. Breathing out, the boy pictured the spell spreading through the forest and loudly ordered the darkness to disappear. He said confidently that the curse would not return. The cave shone with white light. Ko cried out in surprise and called the master to look. The young man opened his eyes to a clear lake glowing before him, sparkling as if alive, while everyone looked at him with admiration. The ant could only wonder where such cleansing and healing power had come from. They stepped out of the cave. The boy sighed, a little tired but calm. Akira looked up at the sky and said the spices were still a problem. Patting Ko on the shoulder, he smiled and said they needed to keep searching. An ant crawled after them. The boy awkwardly thought it was now with them, but he didn't mind. Turning around, he saw the fruits, picked one and happily said he had managed to get it. He lifted it to his mouth, and Ko asked warily whether it was edible. The boy said it had no smell. He bit into it and cried out in surprise when it tasted salty. Turning to Cow, he said happily that this was the very salt he had dreamed of. Now they will gather as much as they can carry and return home. Mizaro cried out in shock when the forest was attacked. After stepping away for a moment, he returned to find many knights wounded and fallen. It all began 2 weeks ago. Mizarost sat in Genamil's office while Genamil smiled and told him he would have to apologize. Irritated, Mizarost demanded why, after just returning from the forest, he had to go back there, and whether the king really meant to send the fourth detachment to its death. Gunmils snapped at him and told him to keep his mouth shut. Mizarost answered angrily that he had already spent a lot of energy after the magic stone cracked. Gunmils shrugged, as if it were only a scratch. Stones gained after defeating monsters can be as small as a fingernail. Mizarost said that beside them the stone in the castle was a true giant, and the crack would not harm it. Genamils listened closely. Opening the documents, he said the papers showed the stone had been cracked from the start. Mizarost said in surprise that it was true, so there was no reason to panic. Gunmils added that if the situation is not as simple as it appears, everyone should act with the utmost caution. Mizarost remembered that the knights of the fourth squad had spent years working in the forest. They destroyed and captured monsters and scouted the area. That had always been their duty. He explained that they had been there many times but never encountered anything supernatural, only the same dark, gloomy forest as always. He noted again that it was probably nothing serious this time. But Gunmils quietly asked if something might really be happening in the heart of the forest. Mizarost sprang up from the couch and, stunned, demanded to know what he meant by those kings of the forest. Gunmills replied grimly that he wasn't sure, but there was something to it. Miserost sneered, asking if he was really afraid, since the path into the depths of the forest will be extremely hard because of monsters possessed by the evil eye's magic, and that is a serious problem. He added that even if things go wrong, their nation, the strongest in the world, cannot lose, and Genamills replied briefly that all they can do is hope. Miserost stepped out of his friend's office. A boy ran up and told him the command had asked for 20 of the most talented slaves to be chosen. Miserost studied him closely. He said he needed a minute. They need to request training for elite warriors. The road to the forest will take at least 10 days. The boy cried out with excitement and ran off. Miserost sighed heavily and wondered why Genamills was so cautious. Knight asked if he meant the commander of the first squad. Embarrassed, Miserost had replied that, no, he didn't mean anything like that. They had been friends for years, and he knew the other was too smart to worry without reason. The young man was curious, since Miserost was the only knight who did not use slaves. Miserost said he still considered slaves to be people. He remembered that Esperanza's slaves were born with the strongest mark of enslavement, felt no emotions, never rebelled, and spoke only when ordered. Essentially, they turned into sexless, shadow-like beings. If you stopped thinking about it, life with them became simpler. Slaves were only slaves. The boy smiled and agreed, saying he felt the same. Miserost added that at least he wasn't as cruel as the commander of the 5th squad. He noticed that sacrificing slaves on the altar of the magic stone had become routine. The boy watched him closely. Miserost snapped irritably and told him to forget what he'd said. The boy laughed and said he liked that frankness. Miserost asked angrily if he was making fun of him. In his office, Genamills went over the papers and thought that despite Miserosta's words, they had to go deeper into the forest or they would never learn the truth. He realized that although the knights of the 4th squad were experienced, they had not even covered 1/10 of the forest, and that was dangerous negligence. Genamills remembered that the forest covered half the world, and no one had ever reached its heart. It is said that centuries after the spell was cast, the inhabitants began to fight back. Taking a book from the shelf, the man thought the magical stone beyond the barrier could not be breached so easily. Sitting at the table, he remembered that since the stone was found, many sacrifices had been offered to him, and that had made him even stronger. Putting down his pen, he shuddered at the thought that someone stronger than the kings of the forest might have appeared in the woods. 2 weeks passed. The knights battled the monster in the thicket, thrusting their swords until it fell and never rose again. One of them laughed loudly, and the others shouted with joy that they had won. Miserost approached and, annoyed, told them to stop. The knight brushed it off as silly, but Miserost replied seriously that even after half a day in the forest, they had encountered too few monsters. He added that there should normally be at least 10, but they had only met 4, and those were enhanced monsters from their country meant to fight only the forest creatures. Miserost said irritably that this was a problem. Although they couldn't blame the mages alone, something was clearly wrong. One of the knights looked at the trees and said the forest looked ordinary. Another replied that everything was normal, nothing strange, just a dark, ordinary forest. Miserost felt differently, folding his arms across his chest as a strange fear crept over him and slowly seeped into his soul. A strange sound made him shout for everyone to stop. Then he said they could rest, but the knights had already ordered the scouts to move forward. The commander called out for them to check for any dangerous creatures nearby. If everything is clear, their next stop will be no Miyagi. He ordered 5 slaves to stand guard and be rotated in 3 shifts. The tense knights admitted that this was truly strange. Miserost asked sternly if there were any suggestions. Someone awkwardly replied that there were none. The commander sighed heavily because problems were piling up one after another. The deputy came to him, looked at the frightened knights, and ordered them loudly to calm down, because without rest, they will not be able to continue the march. He explained that the slaves were not born fearless, but their hearing and smell were sharp, so there was no danger for now. Reconnaissance confirmed no threats, and Miserost smiled and ordered them to move on, but suddenly a piercing scream came from the forest. Miserost spun around and saw the barrier flare to life as someone tried to force their way through the wall of light, and the night squad was gripped by fear. A shock hit him as he realized something had passed through the barrier. No one was wounded, but the ground shook and the monster roared, causing the knights to scream in fear. Miserost loudly told everyone to stay calm and get ready to counterattack, then checked the damage and losses. He fell hard to the ground and, stunned, whispered that it had been an attack by the forest lord himself, but everyone lying there was only unconscious, without any wounds. A knight ran up and nervously reported that they had not found a single slave, and Miserost asked in shock what that meant. It turned out they had escaped on their own, and the man realized in horror that the seal of slavery had been broken, so he had to inform the king immediately. As Akiro walked through the forest, he told the ant that if they were to go together, they should give him a name, though choosing one would be difficult. The boy thoughtfully decided that, because of the red tint, he could be called Shuri, and added that it sounded fairly dignified. Suddenly the wolves growled with joy, and the black wolf called out that Ko and Akiro had returned late because they could no longer sit with the golems. Ko apologized, and the wolf explained that he had hunted prey and left it in the storehouse where food was usually kept. He added that he was struck by the giant sword Golem had, and that it was the most terrifying thing, and when he saw the ant he shouted that a sentry of hell stood before them. The spider asked in surprise why the guard was with the master. The ant angrily demanded an explanation, and the insects stood facing one another. Akiro, flustered, begged them not to argue or start a fight, because he was truly frightened by their hostility. Finally, the ant offered the spider a truce, and the spider reluctantly accepted, not wanting to defy the master's wishes or lose its new home. Ko was surprised to realize his master had reconciled two species that hated each other, showing his immense power. Back home, Akiro entered the hall and was surprised to see the dolls had already finished the ceiling, while the golem hopped eagerly, trying to show him something. Realizing new boards and beams were needed, he promised to bring the necessary materials soon so work could continue. Smiling, he said they would face an even more important task tomorrow, then took out the fruits and solemnly announced that now it was time to make salt. He admitted he was afraid of failing, so he will use only 5 fruits and keep the rest in a storage protected by a time-stop charm. Covering the silver cup with a cloth, the boy squeezed out the juice with all his strength, and soon the liquid filled the vessel. Akiro smiled and noted there was plenty of juice, so it now needed to be evaporated slowly to avoid burning the contents, and the wolves watched with interest. The juice was cloudy, so the boy filtered it for 2 more hours while the wolves fell asleep from the long, boring wait. At last he announced the salt was ready and immediately set about making containers to store it properly. He was glad that even heavy, solid gold could be used to make beautiful vessels, and happily said that now he had real salt. The young man waved the container and proudly announced he now had not only silver, but also magical gold for his belongings. Satisfied, he said with a smile that he'd worked half a day for one goal, to taste truly delicious meat. He carefully sliced the steaks, salted them, and wrapped them in fragrant leaves to marinate, while the wolves impatiently pushed their muzzles forward. Akiro explained firmly that it was salt, and that they must not use it, then put the steaks on the stove and said to fry them very carefully so the dish would be tasty. A frying pan and a little oil filled his thoughts as he recalled a TV show that showed how to fry meat in melted fat and wrap it in leaves to let it rest. Akiro arranged the pieces on the plate and smiled, saying the meat should look well browned at the end, then tasted it and groaned with pleasure. Tears of joy welled from the taste, but when the wolf reached for the plate, the boy lifted it and joked that the meat was too salty for them. The wolf gave a plating look, so Akiro relented, cut off a little, and shared small salted pieces with his friends. He sighed with relief and said he had to keep an eye on them so they would not overeat unhealthy food, since even Karen would be eating with them. The young man looked at the board with the meat, but the bird was gone. He looked up and called for Karen, but she had already flown off somewhere without warning. The next day, as he stirred water in the barrel, he confessed through tears that Karen still had not returned, although, like a wild creature, she should have been able to manage on her own. The more he thought, the harder he beat the water with his hands, screaming that she was still small and any animal or danger could attack her. Ko gently reassured them that worrying was pointless, since Karen was always nearby and likely had considerable magical powers to protect them. He even asked in wonder how Akiro himself was, and whether his magic had returned. And the boy, moved, started to cry and hugged the wolf. Smiling through tears, the boy asked him and the rest of the pack never to leave him, and Ko replied contentedly that he liked the petting and let him keep scratching. Come now. Akira decided to start working on the hides, though he admitted it was a tedious task, and he'd handled it poorly before. He tried to use magic to remove the meat and fat, but everything broke into pieces, and he frowned. The knife did not work either because there were still too many holes. So the young man cut off the excess and rinsed the hide, which immediately turned black and smelled musty. He hung it out to dry and sighed, knowing the hardest part was still to come because the edges harden and become unusable once they dry. He admitted he had no idea what he was doing and was probably doing it wrong, but he decided to wash the hide one last time. After tossing it, he saw the wolf deftly catch it in his jaws, and in a dreamy voice, said that a good pelt could be made into a rug, a blanket, or even shoes. Imagining it all, he smiled thoughtfully, as if it were a fairy tale, and the wolf murmured in surprise that the master had lately been doing strange things, not like seeking food. Ko had the catch in its mouth, and the boy said cheerfully they could delay going back a bit, since everyone was eating more now and dividing portions was getting harder. The spider cut him off and proudly showed its catch, bragging that it had also had a good hunt, which left Akira feeling both fear and amazement. He noticed with growing alarm that since Shuri arrived, he seemed to grow every day, and he was terrified to imagine how large the local creatures could get. The guy glanced at Ko and joked that he was already as big as a machine, then cheerfully said it was time to try making real ham. The next morning, Kuro ran into the clearing shouting that he'd left the hide in the water the day before, and Akira hurriedly pulled out the wet piece. He decided it wasn't a big deal and would just dry it, though the water was muddy brown and the skin was softer to the touch than before. Curious, he looked for the cause and found a branch in the water oozing sap, which probably caused the miracle. Taking a bucket, he said cheerfully that he would try to make a brew from this tree, though he was not yet sure how it would work. Picking up the doll, he jokingly called the new series of stone helpers his kuni, laughing that this time they looked unusually cute. The ants cried out in fear that their master was making more and more golems, and Akira remembered how he had named the first ones the first and the third. Smiling, he told the first to bring 3 pelts he had frozen earlier, and the golems obeyed, showing they wanted to try working on them themselves. The boy watched in surprise as they set to work and even worried that they were developing too quickly. He noticed with interest that he had divided the solution into 3 parts and dried them, and when the elders showed how they stretched the skin, Akira said happily that he understood it would not shrink. At the same time, it bothered him that even though he had made them himself, the dolls worked more skillfully than he did, and it felt unfair, but they pointed to the lack of wood and the cramped space around the house. A young man walked into the forest, looked at the stumps, decided it was time to get both timber and clear the land at once, and then felled another very old tree. Running his hand over the trunk, he sensed it was centuries old and felt sorry, but the wolf insisted the tree was needed by the master, and Akira only sighed. Surprised, he said it wasn't enough, then decided to trim the edges and move everything to other floors, thinking there was a lot of work ahead. Seeing the dolls grab boards and run off, he wiped his brow and, with a tired sigh, simply watched, not understanding their plan. He looked at the cleared plot, frowned, and admitted he'd clearly gone too far, then went inside, took off his shoes, and muttered he'd leave them there. A chair waited for him in the room, proudly shown by the doll, and the boy said with delight that it was the hanging chair he'd dreamed of since school. He added happily that everything was recreated down to the smallest detail, to the point it was almost frightening, and in another room he saw a wooden bathtub and could not hold back a cry of admiration. Walking around the house, he smiled to see the stairs covered with boards, fitted with handrails and anti-slip strips, though the toilet still had no door. Akira half-jokingly imagined Karen would be surprised when she came back, and at that moment a bird indeed appeared, cheerfully circling over the clear water. That same day he went to tidy the clearing of stumps, but where yesterday's remains had been he found nothing and cried out in surprise. The stumps were gone, and moments later he saw ants dragging them, guessed it was their doing, and followed them to the cave. There he met a familiar ant, who cheerfully announced that the owner had visited their home, which was much more comfortable than the spider's nest. When the insect's stare grew too persistent, the young man gave an awkward smile, apologized, and decided not to go deeper. He noticed the ants carefully covering their tunnels and was surprised at how evenly they smoothed the soil, making it loose and usable. Excited, he decided to try making garden beds here so he wouldn't have to look for vegetables every time, and could grow them right nearby. He first thought of the local potatoes because they were easy to grow and decided it was best to consult the ants about the soil. Running up to Shuri, he used drawings to show he needed vegetables that grow underground and are fit to eat while watching her reaction. Shuri looked at him in surprise, but when he understood what was happening, the ants grew excited and quickly scattered, and the boy smiled and waved after them. Picking up a handful of dirt, he told the dolls that since they were making garden beds, they would need fertilizer too, because his father had always taught him that. Together with them, he dug a hole in the shade of the trees, built a fence, and filled it with food waste mixed with grass and leaves. They all stamped their feet to pack down the pile, and Akira touched the ground and explained that decomposition needs enough moisture. With the moisture perfect, he said cheerfully that all that remained was to wait, though he remembered once opening the composter and hundreds of insects spilling out on him. Spreading his arms, he used magic to speed up time and, smiling, said it was extremely convenient and saved years of waiting. Dizzy from the heat and the smell, he ordered the dolls to stir the pile and cast the acceleration spell again. Meanwhile, the wolves chased the wild boars with excitement and, after catching up, were thrilled because they had not enjoyed a hunt like this in a long time. Akira saw a blinding light coming from the pile, figured it might be a sign of success, and left everything as it was since the temperature was perfect. Looking up, he saw a huge bird in the sky and shouted in shock, asking who it was and whether it might be Karen. A joyful cry answered. It really was her, and the bird quickly perched on his head while the boy cried out in alarm for it to stop because its claws were too sharp. The bird cried out in fear, as if refusing to let him come closer, and the boy, flustered, apologized, and reached out his hand to show he meant no harm. Akira hugged Karen and, joyful that she had surprised him so unexpectedly, said he was happy to see her alive, healthy, and so beautiful, and the bird proudly accepted the praise. Koa ran in shouting with joy that it really was Karen, who confirmed and asked her master to take care of himself because she could no longer do more for him on her own. Surprised, Akira stared at the creature, which had wings but seemed to float in the air rather than fly, and he immediately thought they had to lift the curse first. Reaching out, the boy called for a cleansing, and the creature's body shone with bright light. Koa blinked in surprise and asked if it was a water dragon, and Karen confirmed that the forest was coming back to life. Koa remembered a legend among the knights about 5 elements and divine beasts that guarded the forests from humans for centuries, and how the dragons eventually disappeared. He said that if the water dragon returned, the rivers would run clear again, and Karen replied happily that she too hoped for this miracle. Vlovk said dragons affect all living things. If they regain their strength, plants and animals will come back to life, and Karen promised Fenrir she would find the other dragons and bring them to their lord. Koa agreed that because of her speed, only she could be trusted with such a task, dubbed Karen Phoenix, and said he would keep protecting the master himself. The bird joked he wouldn't need it, and Koa waved it off while Akira, beaming, said the creature was incredibly beautiful and glowed blue. He smiled and said it felt as soft as a ball of fluff, and Kuru asked, curious, what kind of creature it was and why it looked that way, and Karen awkwardly admitted she didn't know either. Koa said firmly, it was definitely a water dragon, while Akira stroked its soft body again and laughed that it felt like a warm, fluffy pet, and the dragon happily took to the air. Kuru laughed and asked if he could give it a name, and the creature flapped its wings harder while Koa said that was perfect, and declared the master had named the water dragon. Karen laughed and agreed that Fluffy sounded really cute, and the guy smiled, saying the main thing was that the animal liked the name. Then he looked at the wolves. Akira noticed Shion and the others had returned, and was always surprised that they managed to bring back more prey than he did, while his wolf proudly dragged another boar. Beaming, he ran up to his master, shouting that this time the victory was even greater, and Akira asked in surprise if Shion had been swimming, because he was sure Shion had disappeared into the water. Looking at them all at once, the boy thought the birds and animals were growing strangely fast, like creatures from another world, and he awkwardly joked about wolves that can swim. He approached the prey, admitted he was getting better himself, then patted Shion and praised him for the excellent hunt. The boy held Karen close and said cheerfully that after being away so long she deserved a tasty treat, so he sliced plenty of meat for her. Sighing heavily, he thought he had grown used to the job, though he had no appetite after all those hacked carcasses, and was surprised to find a strange stone near his heart. He took out a few identical ones and, after studying the carcasses more closely, asked whether it was a disease and where the stones came from, since he saw they did not appear in all of them. The young man decided to test it, loudly invoking purification to destroy any strange power, but the magic did nothing. Holding the stone in his hand, he decided the curse had nothing to do with it and shrugged with a smile, as if it wasn't worth worrying about now. Meanwhile, the dolls made a large basin, and Akiro laughed and said he had long wanted to try something like that, and he also made a plate from silver ore. He explained that putting a few tumbled stones is enough, and they will heat up right away because mountain minerals take to magic easily and hold heat for a long time. The young man added they were fire-resistant, so they would be suitable for a barbecue. And, imagining the heat of the coals, he immediately created the needed warmth. He said cheerfully that they could now grill on golden skewers, and after threading the meat he made a real shashlik on the new device. He looked at Karen, who was already impatiently drooling, and cheerfully told her to wait a little longer because the dish was almost ready and needed to be perfected. The boy laughed and explained that his family has long cooked meat over a fire, and raw meat should be left only for Koa and Shuri, who relish the taste of blood. Turning his head, he met Koa's hungry smile, and the boy, surprised, asked whether Koa had been feasting on innards again. And when the wolf licked his lips, he sighed wearily because now everything made sense. Akira wondered if Fluffy could even eat meat, so he added a pinch of salt and a drop of lemon to his own, savored a bite, and felt warmth spread through his body. Smiling, the boy said the taste was amazing but realized he had no kitchen utensils, while the wolves nearby, growling, were already tearing at the raw meat. Akira said cheerfully that they still needed sauces and other small items, then looked at the stone in his hand and wondered if it could conduct magical power. Releasing a little energy, he froze in astonishment as the stone immediately absorbed the magic and the power spread like lightning, prompting a shout of delight. The young man realized these mountain stones conducted energy best, so he used them most often. He soon realized the effect weakened as the magic ran out, and he remembered how once even his magic toilet stopped working. He murmured about using the stone differently, poured in more power, and the stone accepted it all calmly, like a bottomless vault. In the sunlight, the stone flashed a clear green gleam like a real emerald, and Akira said in awe that it was amazing. He asked excitedly if the others were the same, and remembered that the ones found had been green, red, deep crimson, or pale blue, depending on the demon they had defeated. The boy noticed that when the stone changed color, it lost its power, leaving only beauty and no use, and he didn't know how to use them. Selling it seemed the only option, but he did not know who would buy it. He sighed, unsure, and the wolf beside him suddenly jumped with impatience as if it understood something. Akira stared at Koa in surprise when the wolf suddenly sent his magic through the stone, and the boy cried out in astonishment because he had suspected the wolf could do it, but did not know how. Koa threw a stone and picked up another red one, unleashing more power as his eyes fixed on the owner, and the boy hesitantly handed him one more. The boy grew nervous because he couldn't understand the wolf's intentions, until he realized the wolf wanted to double the flow of magic by using the stone as an amplifier. Trying it himself, he held the stone in his palm and loudly called for water, and the glass instantly filled, overflowing and splashing around. Delighted, he said it was incredible when he realized he had a very useful tool and set it aside for later as soon as he saw Suri return. The ant showed full handfuls of vegetables he had dug up, and proudly said he had brought them as gifts for his master. And Akira took a root and excitedly asked if it was edible. Ants watched for his reaction, and Suri urged him to bite off a piece, saying the fruit's sharp taste grows stronger with the flesh. The young man put everything into his bag and thanked the host, but said he was not hungry yet, and Suri looked puzzled while the host had already moved on. The ant asked in surprise where he was going and what he planned, and the spider, chuckling, asked if he was curious while Akira approached the dolls holding a real hose. The boy was stunned, asked when they had managed to do it, took up the tool and was pleased that digging would be much easier with the ant's help. He explained that the compost should be mixed into the soil and then plowed, though he didn't know much about growing and only helped make the fertilizer. Akira said it was worth trying to cut the tubers in half and plant them so more would grow, then asked thoughtfully what they should be like. After they plowed the whole field together, the boy said it was enough and time to plant. Then he picked up a strange tuber and asked hesitantly whether it was really suitable. He noticed she looked suspicious, almost cursed, and Suri hurried to fetch another root, pleased that the owner had a keen eye. The ant said soaking the fruits in water would make them swell and become very tasty, so the boy smiled and decided to trust the ant. Gripping his hoe, he insisted the beds be raised higher so water would run off, and looked with satisfaction at the even rows of soil. Laughing, he admitted he had started with a small garden, but it turned into a real farm. He planted about 100 seed potatoes, and the field still looked half empty. He scratched the back of his neck and wondered if he had made a mistake, and Suri was surprised to see the owner burying again what they had barely dug up. Koa simply shrugged. Karen said happily that he overthinks everything, and Akira smiled and said it was good that he at least planted, though he wondered what season it was now, since it was warmer here than when he first appeared. Remembering that caring for the garden beds required watering and weeding, he decided to make more stone dolls and give them enchanted stones. Akira picked up a stone and said that working the fields requires weed control, watering, fertilizing, and pest protection, so those abilities should be added to the golems as well. He reminded himself that yesterday he tested several stones and found that red ones strengthen fire, while blue ones strengthen water, so their value is obvious. The young man added thoughtfully that the green ones were probably connected to nature, while the transparent ones remained a mystery he wanted to uncover. "Time to try," he said, and gave the dolls magic as they looked at him intently, and he simply smiled, welcoming the new morning. After loudly ordering them to start, he left them in the field and went to the lake with his friends, pleased that the water was crystal clear after cleaning. Soon he realized he could make fish sauce instead of soy sauce, which isn't available here, just as he'd seen on TV. Just fish, salt, and fermentation, a bit odd but tasty, he said aloud as he imagined the familiar smell. Looking at Fluffy, he noticed it was glowing today as if it wanted to say something, but the boy still did not understand its language. Taking out his fishing rod, he said he was now ready for a proper fishing trip, and promised the wolf he would catch dinner. The rod suddenly jerked so hard he cried out in surprise, and a huge fish leaped out of the water. The young man froze because the catch was several times bigger than he expected, and it fell right onto the shore, while Puknastik spun around happily. "This is 10 times what we expected," Akira said with a laugh, and thanked Fluffy for his fishing skills. The boy decided to set aside some for fish sauce and fry the rest with salt, since he had not eaten fish for a long time. Meanwhile, things at the castle worsened as Miserost and his soldiers arrived to report to the king, and the advisor, stunned, asked them to repeat the news. Gen Mills looked at how exhausted they were, and noticed a tired, confused look on Miserost's face he had not seen before. Almost a month had passed since they set out, and they had just returned when a rider rushed into the office, calling all the commanders to the throne room. Clenching his fists, the advisor asked Miserost whether they had found what damaged the magic stone, but Miserost only sighed with irritation. "I'm willing to give my life for my country, but I won't kill innocent people," Miserost said firmly, and his words were full of despair. He remembered that just as they stepped into the forest, a wall of light hit them, and when they came to, the battle was already underway. Then monsters strengthened by their own kingdom rose against them, and the situation became so hopeless that no decision could be made. The advisor shouted that the slaves had not died but had simply run away, Miserost quietly confirmed, and an angry cry rose from the courtier's lips. The king rose from his throne, and his steps made the advisor flinch in terror, as if he had seen something unimaginable. The advisor ordered the 4th detachment to wait for further instructions, and the warriors slowly left the hall. Gommel smiled, called Miserost a coward, and walked away, while Mills put a hand on his friend's shoulder and said with relief that he was glad to see him alive. "I don't even know what's going to happen next," Miserost said quietly, remembering the horrors in the forest where everything looked normal but felt deadly. He explained that the forest itself seemed to push them away, and the moment the wall of light passed through him, he was sure he had died. I don't understand what's happening, he admitted. And Mills thought it might be more than just the edge of the woods, that it was a warning. Miserost asked, fearfully, if he meant the Lord of the Forest, but heard only a doubtful murmur that if it had been him, he would have driven them off earlier. Mills said seriously that someone might be stronger than the Forest Kings, and Miserost froze in surprise as he realized how dangerous it all was. The king walked the corridors, furious and certain the slave's escape was nonsense. It could only have happened if the slave's emblem, powered by a magic stone, had been destroyed. He muttered that it was unthinkable, that the stones had been fortified by sacrifices for centuries. At the window, the king reassured himself that the guards would continue to protect the country faithfully. A nagging thought worried him that the mutations in the forest's enhanced beasts had restored instincts warped by the magic stone. The stone lets me master the whole power of the forest and then become ruler of the world. I will carry out the will of the gods, he whispered, remembering how he had taken the forest's magic and bound its creatures. One more step, a little more, and the end is near, the king said, gripping the sword hilt with a fanatical gleam in his eyes. Suddenly he threw his sword at the slave, killing him on the spot, then shouted that it was enough and ordered the forest burned to the ground so no trace would remain. Meanwhile, Akiro, smiling and holding a knife, said he could finally make the fish sauce he'd been dreaming of as he cleaned a large fish, cutting off the head and removing the innards. Examining the pieces of fish, he said awkwardly that the silver knife cuts perfectly, but he had very little salt, so he'd have to count every grain. He decided 20% would be enough as he salted the pieces of fish and put them into a clay jar without cracks. Filled to the brim, he hesitated about adding more as he sealed the jug and tucked it into a cool, dark place for many months. He smiled, thinking this was where the magic began, and decided to check in 3 months because even if it looks odd, that's the fermentation process. Ko asked, curious, what the owner had come up with this time, and Suri sniffed and said it smelled tasty. Akiro smiled. The scent was sharp and unusual. It was time to strain the first drop through the cloth. A pale light brown liquid flowed into the jug. A precious drop, he said, salty but surprisingly tasty. This will be enough. Now we can fry the meat. He prepared the pan, froze part of the fish, and decided to fry the rest, because he had long wanted this and planned to treat Karen when she returned. When the dish is ready, flip it and pour the sauce, he said, then did so and happily inhaled the appetizing aroma. After one bite, he cried out with pleasure and found the flavor fiery, the aroma heady, and the sensations unmatched. This tastes heavenly and only needs some plain white rice, he said aloud, licking his lips as hungry beasts crowded around him. Laughing, the boy said it was too salty for them, but the wolf's looks grew so wild that he even became afraid. He relented, cutting off only small pieces and promising Karen a separate steak, while the atmosphere remained tense. Suri hesitated, saying it might be best not to, but the boy simply waved his hand and let him taste. Eat more slowly, it's hot, Akiro called when he saw the spider reaching for the meat. He jumped in surprise. Still, when he sat down at the table, the boy admitted the fish was incredible. Seeing Chai, he went pale as even wolves and homunculi with insects reached for his dish. That night, exhausted, he collapsed onto the bed, muttering that his only comfort was the soft futon and vowing to check the little devils on the farm tomorrow. The next morning, a doll came up to him with a shirt, and the boy put it on in surprise and said happily that now he had real clothes. Meanwhile, the ants and golems worked in the field. Akiro moved to help, but the doll shook its head because they had enough strength. Approaching the men working the hides, he found they could manage on their own. The same applied to those hewing the boards. Confused, the boy asked if he was completely useless, and at that moment, a spider and an ant brought him stones. The spider shouted he was first, and the ant insisted it was his. Akiro laughed, glad to finally be needed, and asked where to pour the magic. He studied the stones closely and thought they held a moderate amount of power, enough to become true sources of magic for his friends. The boy looked uncertainly at the spider and the ant as they waited. Silence hung in the air so heavy that even the wolves stood still. Akiro touched the stones and realized they wanted magic from him. When he poured in his power, a stone cracked. Sorry, I poured in too much, he said. These were not stones, but eggs. Tiny spiders and ants crawled out. The insects cried out with delight, and Akira, stunned, shouted even louder. In the forest, he sadly admitted that he had acted foolishly and lost control. Unfamiliar with insects, he did not even realize they were eggs. If it were a centipede, I'd burn it, he muttered, watching the spider ride on Chai's back, thinking it had become routine. He patted Ko on the neck and smiled, saying it was good to meet him. Then he asked Chai if he could scratch him, but Chai turned away. A refusal? Akira laughed awkwardly. Maybe I'm spending too much time with Ko. Chai blushed but admitted he wanted to be scratched first. Ko laughed and asked if he was jealous. Chai denied it angrily, and the boy thought how sweet he was. Sweet and genuine. Akira smiled, and the group moved on. Soon they paused in front of a new cave. There are so many of them here, the boy said, surprised. They went inside, full of curiosity. Creatures drenched in black liquid burst out of the darkness. Ko growled as he stepped in front of his master. Meanwhile, in the castle, dozens of warriors and mages lined up before the king. The advisor announced sternly that 25 mages would set out with the 2nd and 5th squads to subdue the monsters. Rose held some in shining armor and others in dark hoods, and an anxious feeling hung over them all. Han Mills remembered the latest reports, and Gamal spread his hands and smiled defiantly, saying, I've spared these creatures for a long time, but their final rebellion will be their end. He vowed to burn the forest to ashes, his voice echoing through the hall. The knights cheered, and Grind, his comrade, said impatiently that his hands were already itching for battle. Ganmills tensed. Mages had enormous power, and the 5th squad was made up of lunatics who liked destroying monsters. This time their enemy was something scarier than the Lord of the Forest himself. Meanwhile, Akira and Ko fought frenzied animals. The boy set up the barrier in time and sighed with relief, saying he had made it. He squinted and went pale. They looked like Chai. Are those children? He whispered. The spider tensed, and the wolf readied for battle. Akira pleaded, You know me! Wake up! But the beasts only growled. Chai rushed to his master and pleaded for him to save them. The boy shouted a command, and the beasts stopped. He smiled with relief and said they obey him. He pictured a glowing cage and trapped them in its light. The wolves trembled with fear but did not attack. Don't worry, Chai, Akira said gently, and began the cleansing. The curse slowly left their bodies. It worked, he said happily. The animals were gasping and struggling to breathe. The boy leaned over and began treating them. They lay unconscious but were no longer in danger of dying. Blood suddenly ran from someone's mouth. Akira pressed his hands to the wound and poured healing energy into it. Gradually, the wolves opened their eyes. Seeing this, the boy smiled warmly. He had saved them. These are Chai's friends, thin and exhausted, he thought angrily. He vowed never to forgive the source of this curse. And in the castle, the council continued. Let the kings of the forest know the emperor's terror, the king shouted, and the crowd of knights roared as they raised their hands. He lifted his hands and began to cast a spell. A pillar of light shot up into the sky, slicing through the clouds. On the farm, the dolls kept working. Akira watched in surprise as they tripled the fields in a few days, and a real farm took shape before his eyes. Before Akira fully came to his senses, he saw a small lake appear beside the field. He and his friends moved closer as Fluffy circled happily above the water. The boy looked at the ants and, surprised, said they had dug it out together. Fluffy spun water into spheres and began tossing them at Akira's feet. Then he threw a ball of water at the tree. Akira asked awkwardly what that meant. The little dragon demanded the tree be cut down because he wanted to widen the lake. Tired, the boy came home and said he had done all he could. Spiders crawled up to him, looking worried. Akira wondered if something had happened in the warehouse. Going down, he was surprised to see that even the empty shelves were now filled. Seeing golems hauling supplies, he sighed that everything was clear and that they could now preserve the harvest and prepare for winter. The boy suggested expanding the room, used magic to cool the air, and the dolls immediately brought boards. The new shelves went up instantly. Akira watched in surprise as the workers were already arranging the products. The boy picked up the vegetable, and the doll jumped as if objecting. Smiling, Akira and Ko headed into the forest. Surprised, he said they were already at the barrier, only 2 hours from home, and suggested extending it further because that would be nice. Suddenly, he saw a giant dragon in the sky. Ko growled as he tensed. The wolf called out that it was dangerous. The dragon hovered nearby, opened its jaws, and let out a deafening roar. The ground shook. Then Karen appeared, calling out happily that she had returned early. It was calm inside the barrier. When she saw the dragon, she said, "This is a wyvern, a rare creature." Karen told the master that the armor had proven to be extremely strong and could not be pierced by ordinary blows. Akira thought gloomily he had trained for this, but hadn't expected to meet him now. Smiling, he asked, "Is this edible too?" Ko laughed, and Akira waved to Karen, inviting her home. "Don't just stand there. Let's go have dinner." The wolves tore off a piece of meat each. Ko called to Chaya to eat as well. He thanked them shyly and apologized for being so modest. Akira unleashed heaven's punishment, annoyed that he still did not know where the curse came from. At the same time, the king was already plotting. When he tried to act, it threw him back. Terrified, he wondered what had hit him. He was being attacked. He sank onto the throne, stunned that even the king had been attacked. Miserost realized the barrier had saved him. Otherwise, disaster would have followed. Ganmilser added that it looked like lightning striking right in front of the throne. "But the barrier holds," the advisor said. "The king must immediately send the army into the forest." "He already did it," Gon Mills replied. "Surrounded himself with mages and shut himself in the stone hall." Miserost, surprised, said the invincible king had become a coward. Don Melta said the country was never attacked and the barrier is still intact. "You understand what this means?" Miserost asked, alarmed. "The attack came from beyond the barrier." Meanwhile, Akira walked along a path near his home, humming a tune as his animals walked beside him. "I'm glad you're safe and unharmed," he said to Ko with a smile. "Dinner will be big tonight. Golem, get to work." A pile of meat waited for him in the clearing. The boy was surprised they had finished so quickly. Golems were already hauling the hides for processing. Akira lit a fire and started cooking while the animals sat around, licking their lips. Tasting the dish, he said it tasted like plain white rice and longed for real rice with an egg. Smiling, the boy said the lizard's meat was nothing like chicken and that he wanted fried chicken, adding that camellias might grow here too because oil is made from their seeds. The wolves dug into the meat, but Karen jumped up with a cry because it was the dish the host had prepared, and the wolves grumbled that their portions were too small. Akira sighed with tears in his eyes, back in the harsh reality. Sadness closed in as the animals already fought fiercely over the food. The next day, he sat at the table and sighed. Fried chicken was still not coming, but the vegetables roasted over the fire were surprisingly tasty. Having tried them, he admitted sadly they were not right at all, then bit a seed, spat it out, and asked how anyone could extract oil from them, calling them bitter. The spider and the ant brought new fruit. Akira smiled, thanked them, cut the fruit open, and pulled out the seeds. Tasting it, he said the flavor was familiar, asked where they had found the fruits, and his friends took him to the place where they grew. Akira stopped with the animals, staring ahead in shock. A belt of trophies hung across his chest. Berries hung heavy on the bushes. The boy glanced at the white wolf, touched his face, and went quiet, lost in thought. Jen Mills explained it was probably because the king had threatened to burn the forest, while Akira dreamed of tripling or even quintupling his holdings. He pointed and said there was an interesting place over there. The wolf asked warily what the lord had in mind. Akira replied that they would first check the barrier and clear it. In the throne room, the king said happily that the barrier would now protect him, and that this had been the final attack of evil. "What if someone has the power to destroy the country?" Hamels asked. At that same moment, a sphere appeared above the stone. People in cloaks turned away in horror. The king's face contorted with fear. The magical symbols on the floor began to glow. A ball of energy formed above the bright stone and rays burst from it, and the people in cloaks screamed and ran away. The stone darkened instantly and scattered sparks. The king watched in horror as it filled with a curse. Akira blushed with joy, pleased and happy. Ko rose above the forest and said he did not expect to cover it with a barrier in one day. A few days ago, a fierce wind rose up, and the wolf cried out asking what that force was. The barrier sign disappeared, Ko said happily. The spider asked in surprise what had happened to the master. The wolf looked at Golem and thought he was all right. "I'm back," Akira said, asking why everyone had gathered. "You built a barrier on that scale just as expected," Ko replied. Akira grinned and said, "That's just awesome." And when he got home, he saw the golems had already built a wooden terrace. Excited, he opened the new sliding doors. They moved so smoothly. Doors were now in every room, and his dream had come true. Then the golem suddenly tugged his pants leg. "Touch the wall," he suggested. The boy did, and a cube fell from the wall. "Magic. That's handy." Akira laughed. Smiling, he said, "Time to make oil." A juicer powered by magic was already on the table. He squeezed out a bit of oil, and it came out perfectly. The boy decided the device needed improvements for mass production. After tasting it, he said the fried eggplants were incredible. Wolves surrounded him, and he offered vegetables to them and to the spiders. T approached him with the others. "Everyone has recovered, thank you," the wolf said with a smile. Someone asked, "Is the gentleman all right?" Akira smiled and offered some. The wolves greedily began eating the vegetables. The boy said happily that they liked them, and he decided it was finally time to give them names. "You are now Chaya, Chara with white spots, Cheryu, the female chin, Shacha, Chami with red eyes, and Kimecha," he said proudly. The golems whispered behind his back. "I gave you all names with Cha in them because you are the Cha family," Akira explained proudly. The doll beckoned him forward and showed him the house's new balcony. Akira sat in the chair, taking in the beauty before him and dreaming of fried dishes. But he knew it was still impossible without an iron skillet. The boy asked thoughtfully how they could find iron ore without a magnet and then remembered a small magnetic clasp in his wallet. Akira wandered the forest with a smile. Each trip outside turned into a search for ore. They entered a new cave where crystals glowed. He pressed the magnet to it, working by feel, and was glad he'd remembered the clasp. It was a volcanic zone, he thought. The caves had been changing for 5 days, and he began to lose track of which ones they had already visited. Bitterly, he examined the finds. There was plenty of ore, but not the kind he needed. Tired, Ko left the cave, saying he had no strength left. He noticed the wolf was happy with the fresh prey they had caught on the way, so they decided to return home. Akira suddenly stopped at another cave. Icy walls gleamed inside, animals frozen within them. The boy said in surprise, "This is ice, but it's not cold." In the clear depths, he saw a turquoise squirrel moving. When he touched the stone, he felt it begin to crack. The ice trap cracked, and the squirrel leapt free. Akira peered ahead warily. He found her very sweet, then, startled, remembered the wolf nearby, and luckily Ko ignored her. Chai watched warily, and Ko asked angrily what he planned to do with the little one, while the squirrel began scratching the ice to free the others, and Akira helped her. In an instant, the boy was surrounded by a swarm of squirrels, happily crawling over him. He felt overwhelmed, and Chai howled in panic, begging someone to save his master. Tired and sweating, Akira laughed when Ko barked at the squirrels, making them run off, and then the boy breathed, "Thank you," though he felt a little sorry. The first rescued squirrel climbed onto his shoulder. "She looks even cuter when we're together," he smiled. Then they headed home. 4 caves in a day and nothing to show for it, he said sadly. Ko said they hadn't found a single vein. Akira only smiled. "We have time. I'm not in a hurry." Suddenly he remembered the cave where they first found Chai and the others, and since it was only 15 minutes to get home, he pressed the magnet to the wall and whispered that he would take a quick look. The magnet snapped toward him. Akira dropped to his knees and said it had been right there the whole time. Ko asked in surprise what had happened. Karen flew in to report she hadn't found the dragons again. Ko just nodded. The master had also just returned. The bird looked at him happily. Startled by the squirrel, she shuddered and wondered what it was. It scrambled up a tall pole, trembling with fear. Karen awkwardly admitted she had been careless. Suri just shrugged and did not understand everything either. Akira touched his face and smiled, thinking of the many animals now living beside him. Suddenly he saw small creatures sitting in a row in front of him, all staring at him. Stepping into the garden, he was surprised, and said that only 2 months had passed since he began running the household. Pulling out a giant potato, then a melon, and finally a daikon, he said they were huge and immediately began preparing them. "This one is sharp but light, and that one is too sweet. If it works out, there will be more spices," Akira thought. The spider said happily that the taste was incredible. Suri admitted that even he had not expected everything to grow so large. Akira looked at the yard in surprise as Ko and the others drew a map on the ground, and in a moment, a grand map of their future holdings appeared before him. Blushing, the boy shouted for them to wait. He smiled to himself and thought he would soon forge an iron skillet. Meanwhile, the wolf remembered his fight with an invisible enemy, when his friends, enslaved by darkness, attacked him, and he was close to death and nearly lost himself. He thought he had figured it all out, with only a few friends left. The wolf asked if this had once been the hideout of one of the forest kings. They were told this was the place to hide. Vovk said they should rest a little and then fight the people to the end. Suddenly, everything went dark. He opened his eyes, surprised to find he had fainted and did not know where he was. He stood up and wondered whether this was a healing wind or some kind of magic. His body felt light and his mind clear. Someone nearby asked if he was alive. "Yes," the wolf replied. In the forest, he caught a rodent and was glad because he could finally hunt small prey. Grateful to the wind for clearing the gloom, he thanked it. The miasmas that had been choking the forest began to lift. The danger might not have passed. Another wolf came up and shyly asked if he could join the hunt too. "Yes, you'll help me," he replied happily. He hoped he could help his friends a little. Suddenly he heard a strange sound and cried out in fear as something moved toward the entrance. Those who could still move followed him. Huge wolves loomed before them. Someone shouted that it was King Fenrir himself, with another fearsome wolf. Their size stunned everyone. Another person asked if it was a spider with threads, since nothing like this had ever been seen here. One of the wolves spotted a person and barked that the person must be killed. Ko and Chai growled as they stepped forward to protect the boy and warned the others not to touch him. The wolves howled in fear. Akira was stunned. Ko and Chai became huge. He spent a long time exploring the area, learning which plants he could grow, and through trial and error he made his first frying pan. To mix things up, he decided to check the cave again. A spider lowered itself beside him on a silk thread. "You learned to use the web!" the boy shouted as he nearly fell into the abyss. T saved him by using magic. "You have magic!" Akira shouted in shock. Looking at the wolves, he thought they were changing, evolving, and remembered the frightened creatures they'd found deep in the cave. "You've already given up. I understand your pain," he said, and placed his hands on them, bringing cleansing, lifting the curse and healing. One of the wolves said excitedly that it was the same force that cleanses and fills the forest, and Ko confirmed that this man had cleansed the forest and restored their strength. The other asked who he was, calling him master. He could not believe Fenrir himself had called a human master. The purity of his magic was overwhelming. The wolf felt his heart swell with love for his master. Akira saw him wag his tail and was surprised that he looked like an ordinary dog, even smaller than Chai on the first day. "Always be like this," he thought. "Otherwise everyone looks down on me." Akira went home with both new and old friends. Looking over his land, he smiled. The scales still felt strange to him. New trees had appeared where there had been none before. "The field behind the house has turned into a forest," he cried. There was nothing growing there that morning. The spider shouted with joy that the owner had returned. The spider boasted that on the Golem's orders, his family planted the fruit trees the master had dreamed of. The ant proudly added that they had worked many times harder. Frightened, the wolves stared at the giant insects, and some even began to faint from the shock of what they saw. Akira led his friends into the forest again and said they now had their own garden. He still could not believe they had planted it all in less than half a day. Golems brought the gathered fruit. The boy put it into jugs and thought wine could be made from grapes or something similar. Picking up the pan, he remembered it had taken him a month to cast a proper cast iron one, that it had required a lot of work, and he began naming the ore rocks. He called one the universal stone. Parts of the house and golems were made from it. The material was easy to work with and held magical power well. Imitation iron, or real iron, turned out to be hard to work with, but he made the vessels he needed from them, and silver and gold were the strongest. Akira suddenly noticed Fluffy acting strangely. The cat had brought him an empty jar. He asked, "Is something wrong?" The boy filled a jar with pebbles and thought that magical stones are the ones that boost strength and are found in monsters, while he carefully cleaned and put food into the pan. Wringing the cloth, he poured the water onto the grass. The vegetable looked like a potato, so he decided to try extracting starch, following a method he had seen on TV. Akira returned to the kitchen and repeated the process 2 more times. He spread the mixture on a plate to dry. He touched it and smiled because everything had worked. The boy looked at the golems and figured the new ones were resting upstairs while the others worked outside, and they had recently been given separate houses where they now all lived. Akira sighed, feeling a little lonely. Everyone had grown too much, and the golems could no longer expand the 4 floors. He took out the rabbit meat and set it on a plate. He decided to rub it with salt, coat it in starch, and fry it in a cast-iron skillet. That skillet was a real wonder for frying meat. The boy put the cooked meat on the plate and said happily that it was time to try it. Taking a bite, he thought with delight how tasty it was. He picked up the chopsticks, lifted a piece, and tasted it again, saying the flavor was sweet and rich. In the next moment, a spider appeared in front of him. Akira flinched and cried out in surprise. The spider took the piece of meat, and the boy muttered, telling it not to tell anyone about it. The dark-haired man took a knife and started cutting the other ingredients, dropping the pieces into the water. He stood before the cauldron set over the fire, took a spoon and began to stir, and the water before his eyes turned purple. Smiling, he lifted the pot and stirred the dish again with a large spoon. A Golem lizard crept up to him and hid in a burrow, watching with interest. Ko inhaled the scent and licked his lips, saying the master had started cooking. The lizard under a stone stared at the boy, not taking its eyes off him. "I've never smelled anything so sweet," Chai whispered. Ko looked up and asked Karen if there was any news. The bird replied excitedly that after the barrier was widened, she had only managed to cover half the area, and now they are resting here. Akira was holding plates of food when he heard a noise and looked around in surprise. Ko proudly announced he would guard his master's peace. Akira brought out the roasted meat, smiled, and the meal could begin. The beasts howled with joy. The boy set out the portions and said they even had sugar now, so they could try the meat on the plate. Suri said she did not know what the dish was, but it was incredible. Ko ate his portion and shouted to the spider to give him its share because it tasted too good. Karen was moved. Her work had not been in vain, since it was not easy to fly through the miasmas in search of the dragon. Suri noticed a strong dragon aura in the air recently, but it was hard to locate him. Karen replied happily that she had been confused too and could not detect him. Akira placed the food piece by piece, and the animals around him closed their eyes in pleasure. Then suddenly, everyone tensed. The animals cried out in fear as an earth dragon appeared before them. "It's an earth dragon," someone said, and Akira looked at it and smiled. "How cute. How long have you been here?" Fluffy spun around happily. The boy's face flushed with delight. He really was funny. The dragon glowed and rose up with Fluffy. They flew side by side, enjoying each other. Surprised, Akira wondered why they got along so well and thought they might be related creatures. Wolves sat nearby, watching in stunned silence as a thought flashed that this place and its creatures were strange, while the mages gathered around the magic stone and the king shouted, not believing the barrier was intact. At the center of the glowing symbols on the floor, a magical stone rested, surrounded by people in dark hooded cloaks. Fury crossed the king's face. He opened his mouth and demanded that the mages find the cause of all the events within a month. One of the mages began to sweat, lowered his gaze, and bowed his head as he listened to his scream. Several mages whispered among themselves. A girl with light hair and cat ears lay on the floor nearby. One of the mages, without looking back, said bitterly, "How many more lives must be sacrificed to restore this stone? This land is drawing the world's wrath." Meanwhile, the spider jumped down from the tree and reported that his young had started learning to use the thread. Their main job is to keep up the fire and quickly kill enemies. He added that the master showed them Nika's image every time he looked at them. Now they are trying to use it, and prey caught in the web will no longer escape. The spider suggested they could set a trap too, feeling how far they'd come, then grew pleased and said they'd definitely try because the gentleman had many great ideas. Akira came home with the dragons and joked that they now had a flying lizard, but it was too hot to think about, probably around 40 degrees today. The boy paused, thinking a lizard as yellow as a tyrannosaur could be named Patera, Kukon, Salamander, Jormungandr, or even Leviathan. Akira felt disappointed that his words had not impressed the creature, since it was a flying lizard. The creature began to wave its tail vigorously, and Akira was surprised, wondering if this was a real flying lizard. He remembered how, without thinking, he had given the wolves new names: Saura, Onran, Ranki, Aimi. If he'd thought a little, he might have chosen better. Proudly, the boy said the fur looked like the indigo he'd seen before. He couldn't be wrong, but the golems still did not understand his words. Akira walked to the river, dove in and surfaced, calling out with joy at how good it felt. It was blisteringly hot here, easily over 40 degrees. He wondered whether summers in this world were always like this. He swam in the lake with a lizard beside him. Fluffy settled on his head, and Akira said happily that the river running through the forest is a true wonder. He wondered how the stream had been redirected here as the forest and clearings kept spreading and wolves leaped along the branches. He thought they were still watching him and waved to them. Smiling, he watched wolves running through the trees and felt this world was truly amazing. Ko lay down on the ground, tired, and said it felt like the season that had been gone for 100 years had returned. That was also the power of their master, and Chai was surprised to realize it was real summer. Ko smiled and asked what was hard for him to bear. He then looked at the spider and said it felt fine. Chai spoke up, saying he was the master of the hellfire. The spider wondered whether King Fenrir himself could stand such heat. Ko grew angry and said it was nonsense and that he was enjoying the warmth after a long break. Pavuk noted they might be fine, but he worried about the host. Ko fell silent. Akira got out of the water and admitted he felt a little dizzy. The boy looked down and was surprised to see what he was sitting on. Strange creatures were playing beside him, the ones Fluffy had been playing with. They had eyes but did not attack, so they were not enemies. The spider explained these are the chief water spirits. They love beautiful magic, and he'd never seen so much of it. The spider advised the Lord to be careful and not to overuse magic. Akira coughed and waved it away, insisting he was fine. Inside, he felt this was truly another world. They returned home and sat at the table. The boy, embarrassed, saw that the meat and potatoes he had cooked that morning had vanished at once. Perhaps they should cook 3 times as much. That would require a few more cauldrons, since all the animals are fighting over the food. He told the golems that if they helped in the kitchen, they could prepare more food and avoid arguments. The kitchen will need to be expanded. Akira added that they needed to boost the furnace's power and find a way to deal with the heat, and his head was already spinning. Slaves lined up. The mage ordered 100 into the hall with the magic stone. Their strength would restore it. He expected their numbers to keep growing, but an image of a dying enemy appeared before him, and he wondered why it had come to mind. The mage muttered that they had always been slaves, born to serve as temporary soldiers, test subjects, or the lowest workers. In that country, this was the norm. Before, anyone who objected was killed in a public execution. Now no one even dares to protest. The man thought further that for many, this kind of life was the key to prosperity. That was the way of this country. Akira, meanwhile, went to the river to cool off. The sun hung high. Hands folded under his head, the boy lay completely wet from his swim. A fluffy companion drifted gently beside him. He lifted his hand and checked his temperature. It did not feel like a fever, just too hot to sleep. The water felt so pleasant it lifted a weight from his soul. Akira stared through the branches at the sky and knew he could not stay here forever. He had to find a way to contain the curse without leaving the river. He kept wondering whether any civilization existed here at all. If a curse existed, its source could be people, since they had to be somewhere. The boy turned away and said he felt it wasn't just a forest, that maybe the whole world is one unbroken forest. He shook his head and said no. People must exist in this world. Please let them be. And he wondered what a curse was. The slaves were led into the room with the magic stone. Akira remembered that in Japan, curses were always tied to a specific person who cast them. Here, the whole forest was cursed. He considered that the curse might not be tied to a person but to the place, to spirits inseparably bound to the land. Looking at the lizard, he blurted that it was unlikely, though everything was growing stranger. The worst was the shadow that clung to and drained the soul. Ko and Karen had already been through that. Akira decided they needed cleansing. A little more, and the sickly darkness would have swallowed them whole. The curse held nothing good. The wolves chased their prey when Ko suddenly stopped and asked about a strange sensation. Akira explained that if the body keeps absorbing darkness, it becomes demonized rather than merely cursed. To hold back the summoning of evil, he said something like a magic circle was needed, though he had no idea how it worked. Smiling, the young man said, "If it is not a demon but only a curse, we must find and neutralize its source, whether a person or an object." Akira admits he doesn't understand magic circles, so he uses the black stone. If anyone tries to offer a sacrifice to the curse, it will strike them instead. He sat in the water on the rocks, looking ahead thoughtfully. Then he lifted his head and said sadly, "A curse is a dangerous thing. You have to be careful." A man cut the skin with a knife, and suddenly several cat-eared creatures appeared before him. Wizards watched silently in the room. The boy smiled quietly and said the key is to create a countermeasure. Then it will work. If this is an ordinary curse, picture a black stone as a protective image. The hall filled with people around a magical stone at its center. The young man said this was the right and safe way to seal the curse. It was time to activate it. A chief mage sensed something and frowned. The darkness cleared into a bright glow as the magic stone began to shine. People covered their eyes with their hands, while the mages fell to the ground and then began fleeing in panic, not understanding what had happened. The slaves were unharmed. One mage ran to his companion and, alarmed, asked whether he was all right. The companion did not answer because he had fainted. The mage hurried to the head sorcerer and, terrified, cried out asking what had happened. The chief mage stared in shock at the stone, tied with ropes and sealed with an amulet. Akira opened his eyes and, surprised, thought he had just done it, and then sat up, stretched, and quietly said he was simply tired and needed rest. Golems held him by his shorts, and a white wolf stood in front. Fluffy sat on the boy's head. Akira said he would go to bed earlier today. People who could still stand reached the settlement carrying wounded people, and the girl from the farm cried out in shock and asked who they were. The dark-haired boy steadied one of them, lifted his head and said quietly, they had to help these people. Meanwhile, in the neighboring country of Antara, King Esmaruit heard a report from his subjects that runaway slaves from the empire had arrived. The king asked if they were spies. They said the slave seal had lost its power. Esmaruit repeated in shock that the seal, the symbol of that state's authority, had disappeared. A servant reported that the mages are conducting research. One slave told the doctor that they set out to explore the forest as soldiers. Slaves were never allowed to speak without orders, but now something has changed. He said that although he was conscious, it felt like he was seeing the world through a fog. Then a white light appeared. His mind cleared and they all ran away. The doctor asked when it had happened. The slave replied that they had been wandering in the forest for over a month. The king called a council to discuss the runaways. Esmaruit noted that dense border forests helped their country hold back imperial aggression, but otherwise, they generally tried to avoid the woods. That, he added, was why they had not intervened. An advisor then called for an investigation, saying that if they could find out why the seal of slavery had disappeared, they could find a way to counterattack. Esmaruit replied that it was well said. His aim was only to master that magic. The man objected, but the king calmly repeated, "This is good." He looked out the window and said aloud that he wondered what was really happening in the forest, while Akira stood in the gray-green Parvast forest, calling out happily that this year's harvest was unusually abundant. Smiling at the golems, the boy told them to gather the grapes quickly, before the heat rose, and then set to work himself, filling the basket with dark bunches. Akira admitted that cooling the air around his body made him feel better, recalling how he had almost collapsed from heat stroke recently. He said with regret that he didn't remember anything from that day. Ko gently rubbed his cheek, and the boy smiled as his body felt lighter, but he asked Ko to step back a little. The wolf gave a sly glance. Akira said he understood their plan and would not give them the grapes. The animals thought at once that they had to keep an eye on the owner. The wolf said seriously that the man's illness was likely caused by excessive use of magic, since such a barrier requires tremendous power. He added that it was not just the amount, but the purity of the magic. Ko said he had never seen anything like it before, and Suri said he had never even heard of such a thing. Karen said she had been captivated by the sight, but a sudden loss of strength could be fatal, and everyone agreed the risk was too great. Ko rested his head on the boy's shoulder and said cheerfully that the magic had stabilized. Akiro asked in surprise what he was doing. Seeing the grapes, the boy smiled. Now he could cook more and enjoy a little luxury. He had never thought life could hold so many joys. Smiling, he thought sake was most important. Brewing beer appealed to him, but he had no time. Rolling up his sleeves, he announced it was time to make barrels. There was plenty of wood, so the work was in full swing. 6 hours later, he was surprised at how hard it was. He figured out that the hard wood was the problem because it would not bend. As soon as the barrels began to take shape, the water ruined them. The boy sighed and said that was still a result. Deciding to change his approach, he tried a different method. Ko asked what the man had planned and was told to strip the bark and dry the blanks. Suri admitted he wanted to lick the sweet sap oozing from the tree. Ko hesitated, thinking it might be poison. Meanwhile, the golems prepared dinner. Vovike said it was unlikely to be food. Karen swallowed eagerly, drawn by the smell. Akiro raised his hand and cut a large tree into round discs 1 meter long. Then he used teleportation magic to shape the wood into barrels, pleased that magic was so convenient. Rows of barrels rose along the wall in front of him. The boy smiled and decided to expand the floor. Golems jumped for joy alongside him. Meanwhile, the court mage knelt before the king. The monarch reached out his hand and shouted. The emperor said angrily that the stone could not be restored. The mage explained in a trembling voice that they had tried many times and failed. Those who tried to repair it lost their memories and their magic. The king shouted that it was a simple matter. If there are not enough slaves, let new ones be born. Approaching the throne, he shouted that they must start over immediately. The wizard objected that unless they find the cause, everything will repeat. The king asked what had happened to the magicians who had tried, and the man replied that they were still in the room, so the emperor ordered them killed because he had no use for powerless people. The mage watched them go in despair. The king sat on the throne and ordered the stone restored at once. Trembling, the mage agreed. The king looked at his court with contempt because they could not fix the crack. He felt something was missing. Remembering the strange thunder that night, he decided he had to find the culprit. Maybe it was an impact from outside. He sensed someone was using the forest as cover. No country could stand against him. Shouting, he ordered the knights to stop the commotion and calm their hearts. Slaves were brought before the throne. The king, wearing a false smile, announced that the time for sacrifice had come. He ordered the mages to begin the ritual, saying the wasted centuries were over and they had to act. All the commanders stood in the hall. Gan Mills bowed his head, remembering how he once joined the knights full of hope. He taught young recruits that being the king's defender was a great honor. Now his heart was full of doubt. Gamilza remembered his youth and thought no one could get used to such a sight, and he did not want to. But he lacked the strength to stop the king. The king ordered the slaves to rejoice, telling them they would become part of his sword. They smiled, but their shaking bodies revealed real fear. The monarch froze, sword raised, but did not strike as a surge of light knocked the blade aside. Gan Mills shielded his face from the bright glare, and when it dimmed, he shouted that the enemy had attacked and they had to protect the king. But no enemy was visible around them. The dark-haired man grabbed his sword, but something trembled in his chest. He looked at the slaves and felt a strange, uneasy foreboding. The mage told the king not to worry. Horrified, the king could think of only one thing, that his sword lay on the floor. When the mage touched the king's hand, the king pushed him away. The king stared in shock as blood ran from his palm and cried out in horror. The mage hurried to say he would heal him. The king believed many barriers guarded him. He asked where his sword was, but the mage shouted not to move. The emperor, confused, asked what it all meant. The dark-haired youth hesitantly asked to look at the sword. The mage nodded, and the boy lifted the blade, asking in surprise whether it was truly a sinister magical sword. He dismissed it as just an old blade with no power. Gan Mills noticed a rope made of grass, and the mage explained it resembled the bindings once used for magical stones. Hamilton wondered if it was connected to the attack from the woods. Lacking information, he decided to wait for the investigation to conclude. The mage shouted angrily at the boy, demanding to know what he was doing here, and Gan Mills asked why, then heard that this young man had forged the royal sword and had lost consciousness, waking up in that condition. The dark-haired youth lifted his gaze forward, his brows knitting into a stern crease as though he had finally grasped something important. Ganmelza looked at the frightened boy and remembered the mages who died restoring the stone. In both cases, they offered themselves as a sacrifice and lost themselves. The fair-haired people stood silent until they exchanged glances, and at that moment sparks flashed through the air. Remembering that strange feeling, he looked at the slaves as emotions began to stir in them. Hope flared in his heart. This might stop the king. Ganmelz remembered reading his great-grandfather's notes as a child. The forest was dangerous then, but also blessed. The wind rocked the trees, and they gave people life. As a child, he remembered being rescued by beast people, and the kings of the forest described in the records filled him with admiration and envy. Genmelz thought he would one day be able to see them, but speaking about the forest was forbidden in their country. Gamel shouted an order to his subordinate to act immediately. Mills approached him and asked if the destruction had started. He said the meetings were in strange places. Gamal admitted he hadn't wanted to come but had to. He said irritably that his mood was terrible, because when he tried to show his fury in the forest, they sent him to rest, and now he cannot even execute slaves. Gunlosa asked in surprise what he meant. The knight explained that after what happened to the king, it was better to avoid such actions. Gamel snapped that he knew it and could barely contain his anger. Gan Mills replied quietly that the events affected everyone and might even help. Gan Mills, with his subordinate, approached the man. Deciding there were more important things to destroy, he said he wanted to rent slaves. They opened the door and went in. Gan Niels covered his nose at the awful stench. The slave overseer apologized and said they would clean everything on the Golems' cleansing day. He ordered the adult slaves to stand up. Ganilsa watched them closely, noticed a boy who looked away, and immediately pointed to him and chose him. He then took a few more. The steward, worried, asked if they would be killed and suggested keeping at least the women, since slaves were already scarce. Ganamili was annoyed and thought there was no point in discussing it. He smiled and said the slaves would go on a special assignment and that he would mark them so they could be returned. Meanwhile, Akiro and the wolf returned to the farm, and the boy, pleased by the warm autumn and the rich harvest, smiled and said everything had turned out well. Akiro hugged his friends and said happily that it was wonderful to see them all together. It was the place he had once seen from afar that had broadened his world. The boy smiled and said a day and a half of hard work hadn't been wasted. The wolf sniffed the air and happily asked what smelled so good. Akiro said he was glad to see their smiling faces. The wolf noticed the grass tasted fine and wanted to try it. Laughing, the wolf added that when their master prepares the food, it always turns out tasty. Akiro broke off a stalk and said it looked a lot like wheat, wondering where the grains were. And then he tasted it and, pleased, confirmed it was edible and nutritious. The boy said magic could hold the top steady for easy cutting, then gather the harvest, and his friends immediately began helping. Akiro was glad to find grain in this world as well. If it works out, he can finally bake the bread and pastries he dreamed of. The boy said everyone was probably worried, so they needed to hurry back. The wolf lay down and offered to give them a ride. Akiro smiled, thinking this was exactly what he wanted. He agreed eagerly, and was even allowed to sit on top. The wolf called out that they were heading home and ran so fast the other animals were left behind. Ku ran out of the house, calling out happily that the owner had been away for almost 2 days, though he was very worried. Akiro covered his mouth with his hand to keep from getting sick after the wild ride. Tired, the boy said he was finally home. The wolf replied happily that he had brought him back as fast as he could. Ko smiled and praised the animal, saying the job was done. Akiro realized they had covered a route that normally took more than a day in just 3 hours, and he felt drained, knowing it would take a long time to recover after such a journey. Meanwhile, the king angrily ordered the 5th detachment of knights to depart immediately after finishing preparations. and crush the village that had dared to oppose him. Gommel smiled darkly and said he had long waited for those words. He would drag the enemies into the sunlight and crush them. The king allowed them to take everything they needed. Gommel said he only needed mages and slaves. The king smiled, sensing a hidden plan in his words, and told him to take as many as he wanted. The knight left the throne room. The king laughed, thinking he should have done that sooner. If the Fifth Order took the mission, the result will be flawless. Another knight nervously apologized and said a report had arrived from the slave overseer. The king smiled darkly, let him speak, and thought the overseer truly deserved to be feared. A knight reported that some slaves had shown changes in behavior. The king, surprised, asked whether this meant there were abnormalities in the slaves' seals. They replied that no such data existed. The king said coldly that whoever had changed should simply be killed, and the loss made up with new people. The knight said he understood. The emperor added thoughtfully that he was curious who would be brought this time.